Chapter 28 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 28. For the first 2 days of this new kick-up, that fellow Freelands family undoubtedly tasted the sweets of successful mutiny. The fellow himself alone shook his head. He, like Nedda, had known nothing, and there was to him something unnatural and rather awful in this conduct towards dumb crops. From the moment he heard of it he hardly spoke, and a perpetual little frown creased a brow usually so serene. In the early morning of the day after Mannering went back to town, he crossed the road to a field where the farmer, aided by his family and one of Mannering's gardeners, was already carrying the hay, and taking up a pitchfork without a word to anybody, he joined in the work. The action was deeper revelation of his feeling than any expostulation, and the young people watched it, rather aghast. "It's nothing," Derek said at last. "Father never has understood, and never will, that you can't get things without fighting. He cares more for trees and bees and birds than he does for human beings." "That doesn't explain why he goes over to the enemy when it's only a lot of grass." Kirsteen answered, "He hasn't gone over to the enemy, Sheila. You don't understand your father. To neglect the land is sacrilege to him. It feeds us, he would say. We live on it. We've no business to forget that, but for the land we should all be dead." "That's beautiful," said Nedda quickly, "and true." Sheila answered angrily, "It may be true in France with their bread and wine. People don't live off the land here. They hardly eat anything they grow themselves. How can we feel like that when we're all brought up on mongrel food? Besides, it's simply sentimental, when there are real wrongs to fight about." "Your father is not sentimental, Sheila. It's too deep with him for that, and too unconscious. He simply feels so unhappy about the waste of that hay that he can't keep his hands off it." Derek broke in. "Mother's right, and it doesn't matter, except that we've got to see that the men don't follow his example. They have a funny feeling about him." Kirsteen shook her head. "You needn't be afraid. He's always been too strange to them." "Well, I'm going to stiffen their backs. Coming, Sheila?" And they went. Left, as she seemed always to be in these days of open mutiny, Nedda said sadly, "What is coming, Aunt Kirsteen?" Her aunt was standing in the porch, looking straight before her. A trail of clematis had drooped over her fine black hair, down onto the blue of her linen dress. She answered, without turning, "Have you ever seen on Jubilee nights, bonfire to bonfire, from hill to hill, to the end of the land? This is the first lighted." Nedda felt something clutch her heart. What was that figure in blue? Priestess? Prophetess? And for a moment the girl felt herself swept into the vision those dark, glowing eyes were seeing, some violent, exalted, inexorable, flaming vision. Then something within her revolted, as though one had tried to hypnotize her into seeing what was not true, as though she had been forced for the moment to look, not at what was really there, but at what those eyes saw projected from the soul behind them. And she said quietly, "I don't believe, Aunt Kirsteen. I don't really believe. I think it must go out." Kirsteen turned. "You are like your father," she said, "a doubter." Nedda shook her head. "I can't persuade myself to see what isn't there. I never can, Aunt Kirsteen." Without reply, save a quiver of her brows, Kirsteen went back into the house, and Nedda stayed on the pebbled path before the cottage, unhappy, searching her own soul. Did she fail to see because she was afraid to see, because she was too dull to see, or because, as she had said, there was really nothing there, no flames to leap from hill to hill, no lift, no tearing in the sky that hung over the land? And she thought, London, all those big towns, their smoke, the things they make, the things we want them to make, that we will always want them to make, aren't they there? For every labourer who's a slave, Dad says there are 5 town workers who are just as much slaves. And all those bigwigs with their great houses and their talk and their interest in keeping things where they are, aren't they there? I can't believe anything much can happen or be changed. Oh, I shall never see visions and dream dreams." And from her heart she sighed. In the meantime, Derek and Sheila were going their round on bicycles to stiffen the backs of the labourers. They had hunted lately, always in a couple, desiring no complications, having decided that it was less likely to provoke definite assault and opposition from the farmers. To their mother was assigned all correspondence, to themselves the verbal exhortations, the personal touch. It was past noon, and they were already returning when they came on the charabancs containing the head of the strike-breaking column. The two vehicles were drawn up opposite the gate leading to Marrow Farm, and the agent was detaching the 4 men destined to that locality with their camping gear. By the open gate the farmer stood eyeing his new material askance. Dejected enough creatures they looked, poor devils picked up at £10 the dozen, who, by the mingled apathy and sheepish amusement on their faces, might never have seen a pitchfork or smelled a field of clover in their lives. The 2 young Freelands rode slowly past, the boy's face scornfully drawn back into itself, the girl's flaming scarlet. "Don't take notice," Derek said. "We'll soon stop that." And they'd gone another mile before he added, "We've got to make our round again, that's all." The words of Mr. Pogram, "You have influence, young man," were just. There was about Derek the sort of quality that belongs to the good regimental officer. Men followed and asked themselves why the devil they had afterward. And if it be said that no worse leader than a fiery young fool can be desired for any movement, it may also be said that without youth and fire and folly there is usually no movement at all. Late in the afternoon they returned home, dead beat. That evening the farmers and their wives milked the cows, tended the horses, did everything that must be done, not without curses. The next morning the men, with Gaunt and a big dark fellow called Tully for spokesman, again proffered their demand. The agent took counsel with Mannering by wire. His answer, "Concede nothing," was communicated to the men in the afternoon, and received by Gaunt with the remark, "I thought we should be hearing that. Please to thank Sir Gerald. The men concedes their gratitude." That night it began to rain. Nedda, waking, could hear the heavy drops pattering on the sweetbriar and clematis thatching her open window. The scent of rain-cooled leaves came in drifts, and it seemed a shame to sleep. She got up, put on her dressing-gown, and went to thrust her nose into that bath of dripping sweetness. Dark as the clouds had made the night, there was still the faint light of a moon somewhere behind. The leaves of the fruit trees joined in the long, gentle hissing, and now and again rustled and sighed sharply. A cock somewhere as by accident let off a single crow. There were no stars. All was dark and soft as velvet. And Nedda thought, the world is dressed in living creatures, trees, flowers, grass, insects, ourselves, woven together. The world is dressed in life. I understand Uncle Tod's feeling. If only it would rain till they have to send those strike-breakers back because there's no hay worth fighting about. Suddenly her heart beat fast. The wicket gate had clicked. There was something darker than the darkness coming along the path. Scared, but with all protective instinct aroused, she leaned out, straining to see. A faint grating sound from underneath came up to her, a window being opened, and she flew to her door. She neither barred it, however, nor cried out, for in that second it had flashed across her. Suppose it's he, going out to do something desperate as Tris did. If it were, he would come upstairs and past her door, going to his room. She opened it an inch, holding her breath. At first, nothing. Was it fancy, or was someone noiselessly rifling the room downstairs? But surely no one would steal of Uncle Tod, who everybody knew had nothing valuable. Then came a sound as of bootless feet pressing the stairs stealthily, and the thought darted through her, if it isn't he, what shall I do? And then, what shall I do if it is? Desperately she opened the door, clasping her hands on the place whence her heart had slipped down to her bare feet. But she knew it was he before she heard him whisper, "Nedda!" And clutching him by the sleeve she drew him in and closed the door. He was wet through, dripping, so wet that the mere brushing against him made her skin feel moist through its thin coverings. "Where have you been? What have you been doing? Oh, Derek!" It was just light enough to see his face, his teeth, the whites of his eyes. "Cutting those tent ropes in the rain. Huroosh!" It was such a relief that she just let out a little gasping "Ho!" and leaned her forehead against his coat. Then she felt his wet arms round her, his wet body pressed to hers, and in a second he was dancing with her a sort of silent, ecstatic war dance. Suddenly he stopped, went down on his knees, pressing his face to her waist and whispering, what a brute, making her wet, poor little Nedda." Nedda bent over him. Her hair covered his wet head, her hands trembled on his shoulders. Her heart felt as if it would melt right out of her. She longed so to warm and dry him with herself. And in turn his wet arms clutched her close, his wet hands could not keep still on her. Then he drew back, and whispering, "Oh, Nedda, Nedda," fled out like a dark ghost. Oblivious that she was damp from head to foot, Nedda stood swaying, her eyes closed and her lips just open. Then, putting out her arms, she drew them suddenly in and clasped herself. When she came down to breakfast the next morning, he had gone out already, and Uncle Tod too. Her aunt was writing at the bureau. Sheila greeted her gruffly, and almost at once went out. Nedda swallowed coffee, ate an egg, and bread and honey with a heavy heart. A newspaper lay open on the table. She read it idly, till these words caught her eyes. "The revolt which has paralysed the hay harvest on Sir Gerald Malloring's Worcestershire estate and led to the introduction of strike-breakers shows no sign of abatement. A very wanton spirit of mischief seems to be abroad in this neighbourhood. No reason can be ascertained for the arson committed a short time back, nor for this further outbreak of discontent. The economic condition of the labourers on this estate is admittedly rather above than below the average." And at once she thought, mischief? What a shame! Were people then to know nothing of the real cause of the revolt, nothing of the tryst eviction, the threatened eviction of the Gaunts? Were they not to know that it was on principle, and to protest against that sort of petty tyranny to the labourers all over the country, that this rebellion had been started? For liberty, only simple liberty, not to be treated as though they had no minds or souls of their own. Weren't the public to know that? If they were allowed to think that it was all wanton mischief, that Derek was just a mischief-maker, it would be dreadful. Someone must write and make this known. Her father? But Dad might think it too personal. His own relations. Mr. Cuthbert, into whose household Wilmot Gaunt had gone. Mr. Cuthbert, who had told her that he was always at her service. Why not? And the thought that she might really do something at last to help made her tingle all over. If she borrowed Sheila's bicycle, she could catch the 9 o'clock train to London, see him herself, make him do something, perhaps even bring him back with her. She examined her purse. Yes, she had money. She would say nothing here, because of course he might refuse. At the back of her mind was the idea that if a real newspaper took the part of the labourers, Derek's position would no longer be so dangerous. He would be, as it were, legally recognised, and that in itself would make him more careful and responsible. Whence she got this belief in the legalising power of the press, it is difficult to say, unless that, reading newspapers but seldom, she still took them at their own valuation, and thought that when they said, "We shall do this," or "We must do that," they really were speaking for the country, and that 45 millions of people were deliberately going to do something, whereas in truth, as was known to those older than Nedda, they were speaking, and not too conclusively at that, for single anonymous gentlemen in a hurry who were not going to do anything. She knew that the press had power, great power, for she was always hearing that, and it had not occurred to her as yet to examine the composition of that power, so as to discover that, while the press certainly had a certain monopoly of expression, and that same spirit of body which makes police constables swear by one another, it yet contained within its ring-fence the sane and advisable futility of a perfectly balanced contradiction, so that its only functions, practically speaking, were the dissemination of news, 7/10 of which would have been happier in obscurity, and irritation of the Dutch. Not, of course, that the press realized this, nor was it probable that anyone would tell it, for it had power, great power. She caught her train, glowing outwardly from the speed of her ride, and inwardly from the heat of adventure, and the thought that at last she was being of some use. The only other occupants of her third-class compartment were a friendly-looking man, who might have been a sailor or other wanderer on leave, and his thin, dried-up, black-clothed cottage woman of an old mother. They sat opposite each other. The son looked at his mother with beaming eyes, and she remarked, And I says to him, says I says what? I says, so he says to me, he says yes. He says that's what I say, he says. And Nedda thought, what an old dear. And the sun looks nice too. I do like simple people. They got out at the first stop and she journeyed on alone. Taking a taxicab from Paddington, she drove towards Gray's Inn. But now that she was getting close, she felt very nervous. How expect a businessman like Mr. Cuthbert to spare time to come down all that way? It would be something, though, if she could get him even to understand what was really happening, and why, so that he could contradict that man in the other paper. It must be wonderful to be writing daily what thousands and thousands of people read. Yes, it must be a very sacred feeling life. To be able to say things in that particular authoritative way which must take such a lot of people in. That is, make such a lot of people think in the same way. It must give a man a terrible sense of responsibility, make him feel that he simply must be noble, even if he naturally wasn't. Yes, it must be a wonderful profession, and only fit for the highest. In addition to Mr. Cuthbert, she knew as yet but 3 young journalists, and those all weekly. At her timid ring, the door was opened by a broad-cheeked girl, enticingly compact in apron and black frock, whose bright colour, thick lips, and rogue eyes came of anything but London. It flashed across Nedda that this must be the girl for whose sake she had faced Mr. Cuthbert at the luncheon-table. And she said, "Are you Wilmot Gaunt?" The girl smiled till her eyes almost disappeared, and answered, "Yes, miss. I'm Nedda Freeland, Miss Sheila's cousin. I've just come from Joyfields. How are you getting on?" "Fine, thank you, miss. Plenty of life here." Nedda thought, that's what Derek said of her, bursting with life, and so she is. And she gazed doubtfully at the girl, whose prim black dress and apron seemed scarcely able to contain her. "Is Mr. Cuthbert in?" "No, miss, he'll be down at the paper. 205 Floodgate Street." "Oh," thought Nedda with dismay, "I shall never venture there." And, glancing once more at the girl, whose rogue slits of eyes, deep sunk between cheekbones and brow, seemed to be quizzing her and saying, "You and Mr. Derek? Oh, I know," she went sadly away. And first she thought she would go home to Hampstead, then that she would go back to the station, then, after all, why shouldn't I go and try? They can't eat me. I will. She reached her destination at the luncheon hour, so that the offices of the Great Evening Journal were somewhat deserted. Producing her card, she was passed from hand to hand till she rested in a small, bleak apartment where a young woman was typing fast. She longed to ask her how she liked it, but did not dare. The whole atmosphere seemed to her charged with a strenuous solemnity, as though everything said, "We have power, great power." And she waited, sitting by the window which faced the street. On the buildings opposite she could read the name of another Great Evening Journal. Why, it was the one which had contained the paragraph she had read at breakfast. She had bought a copy of it at the station. Its temperament, she knew, was precisely opposed to that of Mr. Cuthbert's paper. Over in that building, no doubt there would be the same strenuously loaded atmosphere, so that if they opened the windows on both sides, little puffs of power would meet in mid-air, above the heads of the passers-by, as might the broadsides of old three-deckers above the green, green sea. And for the first time, an inkling of the great comic equipoise in Floodgate Street and human affairs stole on Nedda's consciousness. They puffed, and then he made smoke in the middle. That must be why Dad always called them "those fellows." She had scarcely, however, finished beginning to think these thoughts, when a handbell sounded sharply in some adjoining room, and the young woman nearly fell into her typewriter. Readjusting her balance, she rose, and going to the door, passed out in haste. Through the open doorway Nedda could see a large and pleasant room, whose walls seemed covered with prints of men standing in attitudes such that she was almost sure they were statesmen. And, at a table in the centre, the back of Mr. Cuthbert in a twiddly chair, surrounded by sheets of paper reposing on the floor, shining like autumn leaves on a pool of water. She heard his voice, smothery, hurried, but still pleasant, say, "Take these, Miss Mayne, take these. Begin on them, begin. Confound it, what's the time?" And the young woman's voice, "1:30, Mr. Cuthbert." And the noise from Mr. Cuthbert's throat that sounded like an adjuration to the deity not to pass over something. Then the young woman dipped and began gathering those leaves of paper, and over her comely back Nedda had a clear view of Mr. Cuthbert, hunching one brown shoulder as though warding something off, and of one of his thin hands plying up and throwing back his brown hair on one side, and heard the sound of his furiously scratching pen. And her heart pattered. It was so clear that he was giving them one and had no time for her. And involuntarily she looked at the windows beyond him to see if there were any puffs of power issuing therefrom, but they were closed. She saw the young woman rise and come back toward her, putting the sheets of paper in order, and as the door was closing, from the twiddly chair a noise that seemed to couple God with the condemnation of silly souls. When the young woman was once more at the typewriter, she rose and said, "Have you given him my card yet?" The young woman looked at her surprised, as if she had broken some rule of etiquette, and answered, "No." "Then don't, please. I can see that he's too busy. I won't wait." The young woman abstractedly placed a sheet of paper in her typewriter. "Very well," she said. "Good morning." And before Nedda reached the door, she heard the click-click of the machine, reducing Mr. Cuthbert to legibility. "I was stupid to come," she thought. "He must be terribly overworked. Poor man, he does say lovely things." And crestfallen, she went along the passages and once more out into Floodgate Street. She walked along it frowning, till a man who was selling newspapers said as she passed, "Mind you don't smile, lady." Seeing that he was selling Mr. Cuthbert's paper, she felt for a coin to buy one, and while searching scrutinized the news vendor's figure, almost entirely hidden by the words, "Great Housing Scheme, Hope for the Million," on a buff-coloured board, while above it his face, that had not quite blood enough to be scorbutic, was wrapped in the expression of those philosophers to whom a hope would be fatal. He was, in fact, just what he looked, a street stoic. And a dim perception of the great social truth, the smell of half a loaf is not better than no bread, flickers in Nedda's brain as she passed on. Was that what Derek was doing with the labourers, giving them half the smell of a liberty that was not there? And a sudden craving for her father came over her. He, only he, was any good, because he only loved her enough to feel how distracted and unhappy she was feeling, how afraid of what was coming. So, making for a tube station, she took train to Hampstead. It was past 2, and Felix on the point of his constitutional. He had left Beckett the day after Nedda's rather startling removal to Joyfields, and since then had done his level best to put the whole tryst affair, with all its somewhat sinister relevance to his life and his own, out of his mind as something beyond control. He had but imperfectly succeeded. Flora herself, not too present-minded, had in those days occasion to speak to him about the absent-minded way in which he fulfilled even the most domestic duties, and Alan was always saying to him, "Buck up, Dad." With Nedda's absorption into the little Joyfields whirlpool, the sun shone but dimly for Felix, and a somewhat febrile attention to the last of the labourers had not brought it up to his expectations. He fluttered under his buff waistcoat when he saw her coming in at the gate. She must want something of him, for to this pitch of resignation as to his little daughter's love for him had he come, and if she wanted something of him, things would be going wrong again down there. Nor did the warmth of her embrace and her, "Oh, Dad, it is nice to see you," remove that instinctive conviction, though delicacy, born of love, forbade him to ask her what she wanted. Talking of the sky and other matters, thinking how pretty she was looking, he waited for the new, inevitable proof that youth was first, and a mere father only second fiddle now. A note from Stanley had already informed him of the strike. The news had been something of a relief. Strikes, at all events, were respectable and legitimate means of protest, and to hear that one was in progress had not forced him out of his laborious attempt to believe the whole affair only a molehill. He had not, however, heard of the strike-breakers, nor had he seen any newspaper mention of the matter, and when she had shown him the paragraph, recounted her visit to Mr. Cuthbert and how she wanted to take him back with her to see for himself, he waited a moment, then said almost timidly, "Should I be of any use, my dear?" She flushed and squeezed his hand in silence, and he knew he would. When he had packed a handbag and left a note for Flora, he rejoined her in the hall. It was past 7 when they reached their destination, and taking the station fly, drove slowly up to Joyfields under a showery sky. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 29. When Felix and Nedda reached Tod's cottage, the three little trysts, whose activity could never be quite called play, were all the living creatures about the house. "Where is Mrs. Freeland, Biddy?" "We don't know. Man came and she went." "And Miss Sheila?" "She went out in the morning, and Mr. Freeland's gone." Susie added, "The dog's gone too." "Then help me to get some tea." "Yes." With the assistance of the mother-child and the hindrance of Susie and Billy, Nedda made and laid tea with an anxious heart. The absence of her aunt, who so seldom went outside the cottage, fields, and orchard, disturbed her, and while Felix refreshed himself, she fluttered several times on varying pretexts to the wicket gate. At her third visit, from the direction of the church, she saw figures coming on the road, dark figures carrying something, followed by others walking alongside. What sun there had been had quite given in to heavy clouds. The light was dull, the elm trees dark, and not till they were within 200 yards could Nedda make out that these were figures of policemen. Then, alongside that which they were carrying, she saw her aunt's blue dress. What were they carrying like that? She dashed down the steps and stopped. No! If it were he, they would bring him in. She rushed back again, distracted. She could see now a form stretched out on a hurdle. It was he! "Dad, quick!" Felix came, startled at that cry, to find his little daughter on the path, wringing her hands and flying back to the wicket-gate. They were close now. She saw them begin to mount the steps, those behind raising their arms so that the hurdle should be level, with head and forehead swathed in wet blue linen torn from his mother's skirt, and the rest of his face very white. He lay quite still, his clothes covered with mud. Terrified, Nedda plucked at Kirsteen's sleeve. "What is it?" "Concussion." The stillness of that blue-clothed figure, so calm beside her, gave her strength to say quietly, "Put him in my room, Aunt Kirsteen. There's more air there." And she flew upstairs, flinging wide her door, making the bed ready, snatching her night things from the pillow, pouring out cold water, sprinkling the air with eau de cologne. Then she stood still. Perhaps they would not bring him there. Yes, they were coming up. They brought him in and laid him on the bed. She heard one say, "Doctor'll be here directly, ma'am. Let him lie quiet." Then she and his mother were alone beside him. "Undo his boots," said Kirsteen. Nedda's fingers trembled, and she hated them for fumbling so while she drew off those muddy boots. Then her aunt said softly, "Hold him up, dear, while I get his things off." And with a strange rapture that she was allowed to hold him thus, she supported him against her breast till he was freed and lying back inert. Then, and only then, she whispered, "How long before he—" Kirsteen shook her head, and slipping her arm round the girl, murmured, "Courage, Nedda." The girl felt fear and love rush up desperately to overwhelm her. She choked them back and said quite quietly, "I will, I promise. Only let me help nurse him." Kirsteen nodded, and they sat down to wait. That quarter of an hour was the longest of her life. To see him thus, living, yet not living, with the spirit driven from him by a cruel blow, perhaps never to come back. Curious how things still got themselves noticed when all her faculties were centred in gazing at his face. She knew that it was raining again, heard the swish and drip, and smelled the cool wet perfume through the scent of the eau de cologne that she had spilled. She noted her aunt's arm as it hovered, wetting the bandage. The veins and rounded whiteness from under the loose blue sleeve slipped up to the elbow. One of his feet lay close to her at the bed's edge. She stirred her hand beneath the sheet. That foot felt very cold, and she grasped it tight. If only she could pass life into him through her hot hand. She heard the ticking of her little travelling clock, and was conscious of flies wheeling close up beneath the white ceiling, of how one by one they darted at each other, making swift zigzags in the air. And something in her she had not yet known came welling up, softening her eyes, her face, even the very pose of her young body. The hidden passion of a motherliness, that yearning so to kiss the place, to make him well, to nurse and tend, restore and comfort him. And with all her might she watched the movements of those rounded arms under the blue sleeves. How firm and exact they were, how soft and quiet and swift, bathing the dark head. Then from beneath the bandage she caught sight suddenly of his eyes, and her heart turned sick. Oh, they were not quite closed, as if he hadn't life enough to close them. She bit into her lip to stop a cry. It was so terrible to see them without light. Why did not that doctor come? Over and over and over again within her the prayer turned, "Let him live! Oh, let him live!" The blackbirds out in the orchard were tuning up for evening. It seemed almost dreadful they should be able to sing like that. All the world was going on just the same. If he died, the world would have no more light for her than there was now in his poor eyes, and yet it would go on the same. How was that possible? It was not possible, because she would die too. She saw her aunt turn her head like a startled animal. Someone was coming up the stairs. It was the doctor, wiping his wet face, a young man in gaiters. How young! Dreadfully young! No, there was a little grey at the side of his hair. What would he say? Nedda sat with her hands tight clenched in her lap, motionless as a young crouching sphinx, an interminable testing and questioning and answer. Never smoked, never drank, never been ill. The blow. Ah, here, just here. Concussion, yes. Then long staring into the eyes, the eyelids lifted to between thumb and finger. And at last, how could he talk so loud? Yet it was a comfort, too. He would not talk like that if Derek were going to die. Hair cut shorter. Ice. Watch him like a lynx. This and that if he came to. Nothing else to be done. And then those blessed words. But don't worry too much. I think it'll be all right. She could not help a little sigh escaping her clenched teeth. The doctor was looking at her. His eyes were nice. Sister? Cousin. Ah, well, I'll get back now and send you out some ice at once. More talk outside the door. Nedda, alone with her lover, crouched forward on her knees and put her lips to his. They were not so cold as his foot, and the first real hope and comfort came to her. Watch him like a lynx, wouldn't she? But how had it all happened, and where was Sheila, and Uncle Tod? Her aunt had come back and was stroking her shoulder. There had been fighting in the barn at Marrow Farm. They had arrested Sheila. Derek had jumped down to rescue her and struck his head against a grindstone. Her uncle had gone with Sheila. They would watch turn and turn about. Nedda must go now and eat something, and get ready to take the watch from 8 to midnight. Following her resolve to make no fuss, the girl went out. The police had gone. The mother-child was putting her little folk to bed, and in the kitchen Felix was arranging the wherewithal to eat. He made her sit down and kept handing things, watching like a cat to see that she put them in her mouth in the way from which only Flora had suffered hitherto. He seemed so anxious and unhappy and so awfully sweet that Nedda forced herself to swallow what she thought would never go down, a dry and choky throat. He kept coming up and touching her shoulder or forehead. Once he said, "It's all right, you know, my pet. Concussion often takes 2 days." 2 days with his eyes like that? The consolation was not so vivid as Felix might have wished, but she quite understood that he was doing his best to give it. She suddenly remembered that she had no room to sleep in. She must use Derek's. No, that it appeared was to be for her when she came off duty. Felix was going to have an all-night sitting in the kitchen. He'd been looking forward to an all-night sitting for many years, and now he had got his chance. It was a magnificent opportunity. "Without your mother, my dear, to insist on my sleeping." And, staring at his smile, Nedda thought, "He's like Granny. He comes out under difficulties. If only I did." The ice arrived by motorcycle just before her watch began. It was some comfort to have that definite thing to see to. How timorous and humble are thoughts in a sick room, above all when the sick are stretched behind the muffle of unconsciousness, withdrawn from the watcher by half-death. And yet, for him or her who loves, there is at least the sense of being alone with the loved one, of doing all that can be done, and in some strange way of twining hearts with the exiled spirit. To Nedda, sitting at his feet, and hardly ever turning her eyes away from his still face, it sometimes seemed that the flown spirit was there beside her. And she saw into his soul in those hours of watching, as one looking into a stream sees the leopard-like dapple of its sand and dark-strewn floor just reached by sunlight. She saw all his pride, courage, and impatience, his reserve, and strange, unwilling tenderness, as she had never seen them. And a queer, dreadful feeling moved her that in some previous existence she had looked at that face dead on a field of battle, frowning up at the stars. That was absurd. There were no previous existences. Or was it prevision of what would come some day? When, at 9:30, the light began to fail, she lighted 2 candles in tall, thin iron candlesticks beside her. They burned without flicker, those spars of yellow flame, slowly conquering the dying twilight, till in their soft radiance the room was full of warm, dusky shadows, the night outside ever a deeper black. 2 or 3 times his mother came, looked at him, asked her if she should stay, and receiving a little silent shake of the head, went away again. At 11 o'clock, when once more she changed the ice cap, his eyes had still no lustre, and for a moment her courage failed her utterly. It seemed to her that he could never win back, that death possessed the room already, possessed those candle flames, the ticking of the clock, the dark dripping night, possessed her heart. Could he be gone before she had been his? Gone? Where? She sank down on her knees, covering her eyes. What good to watch if he were never coming back? A long time, it seemed hours, passed thus, with the feeling growing deeper in her that no good would come while she was watching. And behind the barrier of her hands she tried desperately to rally courage. If things were, they were. One must look them in the face. She took her hands away. His eyes, was it light in them? Was it? They were seeing. Surely they saw. And his lips made the tiniest movement. In that turmoil of exultation she never knew how she managed to continue kneeling there with her hands on his, but all her soul shone down to him out of her eyes and drew at his spirit struggling back from the depths of him. For many minutes that struggle lasted. Then he smiled. It was the feeblest smile that ever was on lips, but it made the tears pour down Nedda's cheeks and trickle off onto his hands. Then, with a stoicism she could not believe in, so hopelessly unreal it seemed, so utterly the negation of the tumult within her, she settled back again at his feet to watch and not excite him. And still his lips smiled that faint smile, and his opened eyes grew dark and darker with meaning. So, at midnight, Kirsteen found them. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 30. In the early hours of his all-night sitting, Felix had first only memories, and then Kirsteen for companion. "I worry most about Tod," she said. "He had that look in his face when he went off from Marrow Farm. He might do something terrible if they ill-treat Sheila. If only she has sense enough to see and not provoke them." "Surely she will," Felix murmured. "Yes, if she realizes, but she won't, I'm afraid. Even if I've only known him look like that 3 times. Tod is so gentle. Passion stores itself in him, and when it comes, it's awful. If he sees cruelty, he goes almost mad. Once he would have killed a man if I hadn't got between them. He doesn't know what he's doing at such moments. I wish he were back. It's hard one can't pierce through and see him." Gazing at her eyes so dark and intent, Felix thought, if you can't pierce through, none can. He learned the story of the disaster. Early that morning Derek had assembled 20 of the strongest labourers and taken them around to the farms to force the strike-breakers to desist. There had been several fights, in all of which the strike-breakers had been beaten. Derek himself had fought 3 times. In the afternoon the police had come, and the labourers had rushed with Derek and Sheila, who had joined them, into a barn at Marrow Farm, barred it, and thrown mangolds at the police where they tried to force an entrance. One by one the labourers had slipped away by a rope out of a ventilation hole high up at the back, and they had just got Sheila down when the police appeared on that side too. Derek, who had stayed to the last, covered their escape with mangolds, had jumped down 20 feet when he saw them taking Sheila, and, pitching forward, hit his head against a grindstone. Then, just as they were marching Sheila and two of the labourers away, Tod had arrived and had fallen in alongside the policeman, he and the dog. It was then she had seen that look on his face. Felix, who had never beheld his big brother in berserk mood, could offer no consolation. Nor had he the heart to adorn the tale and inflict on this poor woman his reflection. This, you see, is what comes of the ferment you have fostered. This is the reward of violence. He longed, rather, to comfort her. She seemed so lonely, and in spite of all her stoicism, so distraught and sad. His heart went out, too, to Tod. How would he himself have felt, walking by the side of policemen whose arms were twisted in Nedda's? But so mixed are the minds of men that at this very moment there was born within him the germ of a real revolt against the entry of his little daughter into this family of hotheads. It was more now than mere soreness and jealousy. It was fear of a danger hitherto but sniffed at, but now only too sharply savoured. When she left him to go upstairs, Felix stayed consulting the dark night. As ever, in hours of ebbed vitality, the shapes of fear and doubt grew clearer and more positive. They loomed huge out there among the apple trees, where the drip, drip of the rain made music. But his thoughts were still nebulous, not amounting to resolve. It was no moment for resolves, with the boy lying up there between the tides of chance, and goodness knew what happening to Tod and Sheila. The air grew sharper. He withdrew to the hearth, where a wood fire still burned, grey ash, red glow, scent oozing from it. And while he crouched there, blowing it with bellows, he heard soft footsteps, and saw Nedda standing behind him, transformed. But in the midst of all his glad sympathy, Felix could not help thinking, better for you, perhaps, if he had never returned from darkness. She came and crouched down by him. "Let me sit with you, Dad. It smells so good." "Very well, but you must sleep." "I don't believe I'll ever want to sleep again." And at the glow in her, Felix glowed too. What is so infectious as delight? They sat a long time talking, as they had not talked since the first fatal visit to Beckett. Of how love and mountains, works of art, and doing things for others were the only sources of happiness, except sense, and lying on one's back looking through tree-tops at the sky, and tea, and sunlight, flowers, and hard exercise, oh, and the sea. Of how, when things went hard, one prayed. But what did one pray to? Was it not to something in oneself? It was of no use to pray to the great mysterious force that made one thing a cabbage and the other a king, for that could obviously not be weak-minded enough to attend. And gradually little pauses began to creep into their talk. Then a big pause, and Nedda, who had never wanted to sleep again, was fast asleep. Felix watched those long, dark lashes resting on her cheeks, the slow, soft rise of her breast, the touching look of trust and goodness in that young face abandoned to oblivion after these hours of stress. Watched the little tired shadows under the eyes, the tremors of the just parted lips. And, getting up, stealthy as a cat, he found a light rug, and ever more stealthily laid it over her. She stirred at that, smiled up at him, and instantly went off again. And he thought, poor little sweetheart, she was tired. And a passionate desire to guard her from trials and troubles came on him. At 4 o'clock, Kirsteen slipped in again and whispered, "She made me promise to come for her. How pretty she looks sleeping." "Yes," Felix answered, "pretty and good." Nedda raised her head, stared up at her aunt, and a delighted smile spread over her face. "Is it time again? How lovely!" Then, before either could speak or stop her, she was gone. "She's more in love," Kirsteen murmured, "than I ever saw a girl of her age." "She is more in love," Felix answered, "than is good to see." "She is not truer than Derek is." "Well, that may be, but she will suffer from him." "Women who love must always suffer." Her cheeks were sunk and shadowy. She looked very tired. When she had gone to get some sleep, Felix restored the fire and put on a kettle, meaning to make himself some coffee. Morning had broken, clear and sparkling after the long rain, and full of scent and song. What glory equalled this early morning radiance, the dewy wonder of everything? What hour of the day was such a web of youth and beauty as this, when all the stars from all the skies had fallen into the grass. A cold nose was thrust into his hand, and he saw beside him Tod's dog. The animal was wet and lightly moved his white-tipped tail, while his dark yellow eyes inquired of Felix what he was going to give a dog to eat. Then Felix saw his brother come in. Tod's face was wild and absent, as a man with all his thoughts turned on something painful in the distance. His ruffled hair had lost its brightness. His eyes looked as if driven back into his head. He was splashed with mud and wet from head to foot. He walked up to the hearth without a word. "Well, old man?" said Felix anxiously. Tod looked at him, but did not answer. "Come," said Felix, "tell us." "Locked up," said Tod, in a voice unlike his own. "I didn't knock them down." "Heavens, I should hope not." "I ought to have." Felix put his hand within his brother's arm. "They twisted her arms. One of them pushed her from behind. I can't understand it. How was it I didn't? I can't understand." "I can," said Felix. "They were the law. If they'd been mere men, you'd have done it fast enough." "I can't understand," Tod repeated. "I've been walking ever since." Felix stroked his shoulder. "Go upstairs, old man. Kirsteen's anxious." Tod sat down and took his boots off. "I can't understand," he said once more. Then, without another word or even a look at Felix, he went out and up the stairs. And Felix thought, "Poor Kirsteen. Ah, well, they're all about as queer, one as the other. How to get Nedda out of it?" And with that question gnawing at him, he went out into the orchard. The grass was drenching wet, so he descended to the road. 2 wood-pigeons were crooning to each other, truest of all sounds of summer. There was no wind, and the flies had begun humming. In the air, cleared of dust, the scent of hay was everywhere. What about those poor devils of labourers now? They would get the sack for this. And he was suddenly beset with a feeling of disgust. This world where men, and women too, held what they had, took what they could. This world of seeing only one thing at a time, this world of force and cunning, of struggle and primitive appetites, of such good things too, such patience, endurance, heroism, and yet at heart so unutterably savage. He was very tired, but it was too wet to sit down, so he walked on. Now and again he passed a labourer going to work, but very few in all those miles, and they quite silent. Did they ever really whistle? Felix thought. Were they ever jolly ploughmen, or was that always a fiction? Surely they can't give tongue this morning. They never can. He crossed a stile and took a slanting path through a little wood. The scent of leaves and sap, the dapple of sunlight, all the bright early glow and beauty struck him with such force that he could have cried out in the sharpness of sensation. At that hour, when man was still abed and the land lived its own life, how full and sweet and wild that life seemed, how in love with itself. Truly all the trouble in the world came from the manifold disharmonies of the self-conscious animal called man. Then, coming out on the road again, he saw that he must be within a mile or 2 of Becket, and finding himself suddenly very hungry, determined to go there and get some breakfast. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 31. Duly shaved with one of Stanley's razors, bathed and breakfasted, Felix was on the point of getting into the car to return to Joyfields when he received a message from his mother. Would he please go up and see her before he went? He found her looking anxious and endeavouring to conceal it. Having kissed him, she drew him to her sofa and said, "Now, darling, come and sit down here and tell me all about this dreadful business." And taking up an odorator, she blew over him a little cloud of scent. "It's quite a new perfume. Isn't it delicious?" Felix, who dreaded scent, concealed his feelings, sat down, and told her. And while he told her, he was conscious of how pathetically her fastidiousness was quivering under those gruesome details. Fighting with policemen, fighting with common men, prison for a lady. Conscious, too, of her still more pathetic effort to put a good face on it. When he had finished, she remained so perfectly still, with lips so hard compressed, that he said, "It's no good worrying, Mother." Frances Freeland rose, pulled something hard, and a cupboard appeared. She opened it and took out a travelling bag. "I must go back with you at once," she said. "I don't think it's in the least necessary, and you'll only knock yourself up." "Oh, nonsense, darling, I must." Knowing that further dissuasion would harden her determination, Felix said, "I'm going in the car." "That doesn't matter. I shall be ready in 10 minutes. Oh, and do you know this? It's splendid for taking lines out under the eyes." She was holding out a little round box with the lid off. "Just wet your finger with it and dab it gently on." Touched by this evidence of her deep desire that he should put as good a face on it as herself, Felix dabbed himself under the eyes. "That's right. Now wait for me, dear. I shan't be a minute. I've only to get my things. They'll all go splendidly in this little bag." In a quarter of an hour they had started. During that journey Frances Freeland betrayed no sign of tremor. She was going into action, and therefore had no patience with her nerves. "Are you proposing to stay, Mother?" Felix hazarded, "because I don't think there's a room for you." "Oh, that's nothing, darling. I sleep beautifully in a chair. It suits me better than lying down." Felix cast up his eyes and made no answer. On arriving, they found that the doctor had been there, expressed his satisfaction, and enjoined perfect quiet. Tod was on the point of starting back to Transham, where Sheila and the 2 labourers would be brought up before the magistrates. Felix and Kirsteen took hurried counsel. Now that Mother, whose nursing was beyond reproach, had come, it would be better if they went with Tod. All 3 started forthwith in the car. Left alone, Frances Freeland took her bag, a noticeably old one, without any patent clasp whatever, so that she could open it, went noiselessly upstairs, tapped on Derek's door, and went in. A faint but cheerful voice remarked, "Hello, Granny." Frances Freeland went up to the bed, smiled down on him ineffably, laid a finger on his lips, and said in the stillest voice, "You mustn't talk, darling." Then she sat down in the window with her bag beside her. Half a tear had run down her nose, and she had no intention that it should be seen. She therefore opened her bag, and having taken out a little bottle, beckoned Nedda. "Now, darling," she whispered, "you must take just one of these. It's nothing new. They're what my mother used to give me at your age. And for 1 hour you must go out and get some fresh air, and then you can come back." "Must I, Granny?" "Yes, you must keep up your strength. Kiss me." Nedda kissed a cheek that seemed extraordinarily smooth and soft, received a kiss in the middle of her own, and having stayed a second by the bed, looking down with all her might, went out. Frances Freeland, in the window, wasted no thoughts, but began to run over in her mind the exact operations necessary to defeat this illness of darling Derek's. Her fingers continually locked and interlocked themselves with fresh determinations. Her eyes, fixed on imaginary foods, methods of washing, and ways of keeping him quiet, had an almost fanatical intensity. Like a good general, she marshalled her means of attack and fixed them in perfect order. Now and then she gazed into her bag, making quite sure that she had everything, and nothing that was new-fangled or liable to go wrong. For into action she never brought any of those patent novelties that delighted her soul in times of peace. For example, when she herself had pneumonia and no doctor for 2 months, it was well known that she had lain on her back, free from every kind of remedy, employing only courage, nature, and beef tea, or some such simple sustenance. Having now made her mental dispositions, she got up without sound and slipped off a petticoat that she suspected of having rustled a little when she came in. Folding and popping it where it could not be suspected any more, she removed her shoes and put on very old velvet slippers. She walked in these toward the bed, listening to find out whether she could hear herself, without success. Then, standing where she could see when his eyes opened, she began to take stock. That pillow wasn't very comfortable. A little table was wanted on both sides instead of on one. There was no odorator, and she did not see one of those arrangements. All these things would have to be remedied. Absorbed in this reconnoitring, she failed to observe that darling Derek was looking at her through eyelashes that were always so nice and black. He said suddenly, in that faint and cheerful voice, "All right, Granny, I'm going to get up tomorrow." Francis Freeland, whose principle it was that people should always be encouraged to believe themselves better than they were, answered, "Yes, darling, of course. You'll be up in no time. It'll be delightful to see you in a chair tomorrow. But you mustn't talk." Derek sighed, closed his eyes, and went off into a faint. It was in moments such as these that Francis Freeland was herself. Her face flushed a little and grew terribly determined. Conscious that she was absolutely alone in the house, she ran to her bag, took out her sal volatile, applied it vigorously to his nose, and poured a little between his lips. She did other things to him, and not until she had brought him round and the best of it was already made did she even say to herself, "It's no use fussing, I must make the best of it." Then, having discovered that he felt quite comfortable, as he said, she sat down in a chair to fan him and tremble vigorously. She would not have allowed that movement of her limbs if it had in any way interfered with the fanning. But since, on the contrary, it seemed to be of assistance, she certainly felt it a relief. For whatever age her spirit might be, her body was 73. And, while she fanned, she thought of Derek as a little black-haired, blazing grey-eyed slip of a sallow boy, all little thin legs and arms moving funnily like a foal's. He'd been such a dear, gentleman-like little chap. It was dreadful he should be forgetting himself so and getting into such trouble. And her thoughts passed back beyond him to her own 4 little sons, among whom she had been so careful not to have a favourite, but to love them all equally. And she thought of how their holland suits wore out, especially in the elastic, and got green behind almost before they were put on, and of how she used to cut their hairs, spending at least 3/4 of an hour on each, because she had never been quick at it, while they sat so good, except Stanley and darling Tod, who wouldn't move just as she got into the comb particularly nice bits of his hair, always so crisp and difficult, and of how she had cut off Felix's long golden curls when he was 4, and would have cried over it if crying hadn't always been so silly, and of how beautifully they had all had their measles together, so that she had been up with them day and night for about a fortnight, and of how it was a terrible risk with Derek and darling Nedda, not at all a wise match, she was afraid. Yet, if they really were attached, of course one must put the best face on it. And how lovely it would be to see another little baby some day, and what a charming little mother Nedda would make, if only the dear child would do her hair just a little differently. And she perceived that Derek was asleep, and one of her own legs from the knee down. She would certainly have bad pins and needles if she did not get up, but since she would not wake him for the world, she must do something else to cure it. And she hit upon this plan. She had only to say, "Nonsense, you haven't anything of the sort," and it was sure to go away. She said this to her leg, but being a realist, she only made it feel like a pincushion. She knew, however, that she had only to persevere, because it would never do to give in. She persevered, and her leg felt as if red-hot needles were being stuck in it. Then, for the life of her, she could not help saying a little psalm. The sensation went away and left her leg quite dead. She would have no strength in it at all when she got up. But that would be easily cured when she could get to her bag with 3 globules of nux vomica, and darling Derek must not be waked up for anything. She waited thus till Nedda came back, and then said, "Shh." He woke at once, so that providentially she was able to get up, and having stood with her weight on one leg for 5 minutes, so as to be quite sure she did not fall, she crossed back to the window, took her nux vomica, and sat down with her tablets to note down the little affairs she would require, while Nedda took her place beside the bed to fan him. Having made her list, she went to Nedda and whispered that she was going down to see about 1 or 2 little things, and while she whispered, she arranged the dear child's hair. If only she would keep it just like that, it would be so much more becoming. And she went downstairs. Accustomed to the resources of Stanley's establishment, or at least to those of John's and Felix's, and of the hostels she stared at, she felt for a moment just a little nonplussed at discovering at her disposal nothing but 3 dear little children playing with a dog, and 1 bicycle. For a few seconds she looked at the latter hard. If only it had been a tricycle. Then, feeling certain that she could not make it into one, she knew that she must make the best of it, especially as, in any case, she could not have used it, for it would never do to leave darling Nedda alone in the house. She decided, therefore, to look in every room to see if she could find the things she wanted. The dog, who had been attracted by her, left the children and came too, and the children, attracted by the dog, followed. So they all five went into a room on the ground floor. It was partitioned into two by a screen. In one portion was a rough camp bedstead, and in the other two dear little child's beds that must once have been Derek's and Sheila's, and one, still smaller, made out of a large packing case. The eldest of the little children said, "That's where Billy sleeps. Susan sleeps here, and I sleeps there, and our father slept in here before he went to prison." Francis Freeland experienced a shock. To prison? The idea of letting these little things know such a thing as that! The best face had so clearly not been put on it that she decided to put it herself. "Oh, not to prison, dear, only to a house in the town for a little while." It seemed to her quite dreadful that they should know the truth. It was simply necessary to put it out of their heads. That dear little girl looked so old already, such a little mother. And as they stood about her, she gazed piercingly at their heads. They were quite clean. The second dear little thing said, "We like being here. We hope father won't be coming back from prison for a long time, so we can go on staying here. Mr. Freeland gives us apples." The failure of her attempt to put a nicer idea into their heads disconcerted Francis Freeland for a moment only. She said, "Who told you he was in prison?" Biddy answered slowly, "Nobody didn't tell us. We picked it up." "Oh, but you should never pick things up. That's not at all nice. You don't know what harm they may do you." Billy replied, "We picked up a dead cat yesterday. Didn't scratch a bit, it didn't." And Billy added, "Please, what is prison like?" Pity seized on Francis Freeland for these little derelicts, whose heads and pinafores and faces were so clean. She pursed her lips very tight and said, "Hold out your hands, all of you." 3 small hands were held out, and 3 small pairs of grey-blue eyes looked up at her. From the recesses of her pocket she drew forth her purse, took from it 3 shillings, and placed one in the very centre of each palm. The 3 small hands closed. 2 small grave bodies dipped in little curtsies. The third remained stock still, but a grin spread gradually on its face from ear to ear. "What do you say?" said Francis Freeland. "Thank you." "Thank you what?" "Thank you, ma'am." "That's right. Now run away and play a nice game in the orchard." The 3 turned immediately and went. A sound of whispering rose busily outside. Francis Freeland, glancing through the window, saw them unlatching the wicket-gate. She put out her head and called. Biddy came back. "You mustn't spend them all at once." Biddy shook her head. "No, once we had a shilling and we were sick. We're going to spend 3 pennies out of 1 shilling every day till they're gone." "And aren't you going to put any by for a rainy day?" "No." Francis Freeland did not know what to answer. Dear little things. The dear little things vanished. In Tod's and Kirsteen's room she found a little table and a pillow, and something that might do, and having devised a contrivance by which this went into that, and that into this, and nothing whatever showed, she conveyed the whole very quietly up near dear Derek's room, and told darling Nedda to go downstairs and look for something that she knew she would not find, for she could not think at the moment of any better excuse. When the child had gone, she popped this here and popped that there, and there she was, and she felt better. It was no use whatever to make a fuss about that aspect of nursing which was not quite nice. One just put the best face upon it, quietly did what was necessary, and pretended that it was not there. Kirsteen had not seen to things quite as she should have. But then dear Kirsteen was so clever. Her attitude, indeed, to that blue bird, who had alighted now 21 years ago in the Freeland nest, had always, after the first few shocks, been duly stoical. For however her fastidiousness might jib at neglect of the forms of things, she was the last woman not to appreciate really sterling qualities. Though it was a pity dear Kirsteen did expose her neck and arms so that they had got quite brown, a pity that she never went to church and had brought up the dear children not to go, and to have ideas that were not quite right about the land. Still, she was emphatically a lady, and devoted to dear Tod, and very good. And her features were so regular, and she had such a good colour, and was so slim and straight in the back, that she was always a pleasure to look at. And if she was not quite so practical as she might have been, that was not everything, and she would never get stout, as there was every danger of Clara doing, so that from the first she had always put a good face on her. Derek's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I'm awfully thirsty, Granny." "Yes, darling. Don't move your head, and just let me pop in some of this delicious lemonade with a spoon." Nedda, returning, found her supporting his head with one hand, while with the other she kept popping in the spoon, her soul smiling at him lovingly through her lips and eyes. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 32. Felix went back to London the afternoon of Francis Freeland's installation, taking Sheila with him. She had been bound over to keep the peace, a task which she would obviously be the better able to accomplish at a distance. And, though to take charge of her would be rather like holding a burning match till there was no match left, he felt bound to volunteer. He left Nedda with many misgivings, but had not the heart to wrench her away. The recovery of a young man who means to get up tomorrow is not so rapid when his head, rather than his body, is the seat of trouble. Derek's temperament was against him. He got up several times in spirit to find that his body had remained in bed, and this did not accelerate his progress. It had been impossible to dispossess Francis Freeland from command of the sick-room, and since she was admittedly from experience and power of paying no attention to her own wants the fittest person for the position, there she remained, taking turn and turn about with Nedda, and growing a little whiter, a little thinner, more resolute in face, and more loving in her eyes from day to day. That tragedy of the old, the being laid aside from life before the spirit is ready to resign, the feeling that no one wants you, that all those you have borne and brought up have long passed on to roads where you cannot follow, but even the thought-life of the world streams by so fast that you lie up in a backwater, feebly, blindly groping for the full of the water, and always pushed gently, hopelessly back. That sense that you are still young and warm, and yet so furbeloed with old thoughts and fashions that none can see how young and warm you are, none see how you long to rub hearts with the active, how you learn for something real to do that can help life on, and how no one will give it you. All this tragedy, was for the time defeated. She was in triumph, doing something real for those she loved and longed to do things for. She had Sheila's room. For a week at least, Derek asked no questions, made no allusion to the mutiny, not even to the cause of his own disablement. It had been impossible to tell whether the concussion had driven coherent recollection from his mind, or whether he was refraining from an instinct of self-preservation, barring such thoughts as too exciting. Nedda dreaded every day lest he should begin. She knew that the questions would fall on her, since no answer could possibly be expected from Granny, except, "It's all right, darling, everything's going on perfectly, only you mustn't talk." It began the last day of June, the very first day that he got up. "They didn't save the hay, did they?" Was he fit to hear the truth? Would he forgive her if she did not tell it? If she lied about this, could she go on lying to his other questions? When he discovered, later, would not the effect undo the good of lies now? She decided to lie, but when she opened her lips, simply could not, with his eyes on her, and said faintly, "Yes, they did." His face contracted. She slipped down at once and knelt beside his chair. He said between his teeth, "Go on, tell me, did it all collapse?" She could only stroke his hands and bow her head. "I see. What happened to them?" Without looking up, she murmured, "Some have been dismissed. The others are working again, all right." "All right?" She looked up then so pitifully that he did not ask her anything more. But the news put him back a week, and she was in despair. The day he got up again, he began afresh. "When are the assizes?" 7th of August. "Has anybody been to see Bob Trist?" "Yes, Aunt Kirsteen has been twice." Having been thus answered, he was quiet for a long time. She had slipped again out of her chair to kneel beside him. It seemed the only place from which she could find courage for her answers. He put his hand, that had lost its brown, on her hair. At that she plucked up spirit to ask, "Would you like me to go and see him?" He nodded. Then I will, tomorrow. Don't ever tell me what isn't true, Nedda. People do. That's why I didn't ask before. She answered fervently. I won't. Oh, I won't. She dreaded this visit to the prison. Even to think of those places gave her nightmare. Sheila's description of her night in a cell had made her shiver with horror. But there was a spirit in Nedda that went through with things, and she started early the next day, refusing Kirsteen's proffered company. The look of that battlemented building, whose walls were pierced with emblems of the Christian faith, turned her heartsick, and she stood for several minutes outside the dark green door before she could summon courage to ring the bell. A stout man in blue, with a fringe of grey hair under his peaked cap and some keys dangling from a belt, opened and said, "Yes, miss." Being called Miss gave her a little spirit, and she produced the card she'd been warming in her hand. "I've come to see a man called Robert Trist, waiting for trial at the assizes." The stout man looked at the card, back and front, as is in the way of those in doubt, closed the door behind her, and said, "Just a minute, miss." The shutting of the door behind her sent a little shiver down Nedda's spine, but the temperature of her soul was rising, and she looked round. Beyond the heavy arch, beneath which she stood, was a courtyard where she could see two men, also in blue, with peaked caps. Then to her left she became conscious of a shaven-headed, noiseless being in drab grey clothes, on hands and knees, scrubbing the end of a corridor. Her tremor at the stealthy ugliness of this crouching figure yielded at once to a spasm of pity. The man gave her a look, furtive, yet so charged with intense penetrating curiosity that it seemed to let her suddenly into innumerable secrets. She felt as if the whole life of people shut away in silence and solitude were disclosed to her in the swift, unutterably alive look of this noiseless, kneeling creature, riving out of her something to feed his soul and body on. That look seemed to lick its lips. It made her angry, made her miserable, with a feeling of pity she could hardly bear. Tears, too, started to flow, darkened her eyes. Poor man! How he must hate her, who was free, and all fresh from the open world and the sun, and people to love and to talk to. The poor man scrubbed on steadily, his ears standing out from his shaven head. Then, dragging his knee-mat skewways, he took the chance to look at her again. Perhaps because his dress and cap and stubble of hair and even the colour of his face were so drab grey, those little dark eyes seemed to her the most terribly living things she had ever seen. She felt that they had taken her in from top to toe, clothed and unclothed, taken in the resentment she had felt and the pity she was feeling. They seemed at once to appeal, to attack, and to possess her ravenously, as though all the starved instincts in a whole prisoned world had rushed up and for a second stood outside their bars. Then came the clank of keys. The eyes left her as swiftly as they had seized her, and he became again just that stealthy, noiseless creature scrubbing a stone floor. And Nedda, shivering, thought, "I can't bear myself here, me with everything in the world I want, and these with nothing." But the stout janitor was standing by her again, together with another man in blue, who said, "Now, miss, this way, please." And down that corridor they went. Though she did not turn, she knew well that those eyes were following, still riving something from her, and she heaved a sigh of real relief when she was round a corner. Through barred windows that had no glass she could see another court, where men in the same drab grey clothes, printed with arrows, were walking one behind the other, making a sort of moving human hieroglyphic in the centre of the concrete floor. Two warders with swords stood just outside its edge. Some of those walking had their heads up, their chests expanded. Some slouched along with heads almost resting on their chests, but most had their eyes fixed on the back of the neck of the man in front, and there was no sound save the tramp of feet. Nedda put her hand to her throat. The warder beside her said in a chatty voice, "That's where the Ards take their exercise, miss. You want to see a man called Trist waiting trial, I think. I've had a woman here to see him and a lady in blue once or twice." "My aunt." "Yeah, just so. Labourer, I think. Case of arson. Funny thing, never yet found a farm labourer that took the prison well." Nedda shivered. The words sounded ominous. Then a little flame lit itself within her. "Does anybody ever take to prison?" The warder uttered a sound between a grunt and chuckle. The sun has a better chime here than they have out any day. No doubt about it. They're well fed here. Her aunt's words came suddenly into Nedda's mind. Liberty's a glorious feast. But she did not speak them. Yes, the water proceeded. Some of them we get look as if they didn't have a square meal outside from one year's end to the other. If you just wait a minute, miss, I'll fetch the man down to you. In a bare room with distempered walls and bars to a window out of which she could see nothing but a high brick wall, Nedda waited. So rapid is the adjustment of the human mind, so quick the blunting of human sensation, that she had already not quite the passion of pitiful feeling which had stormed her standing under that archway. A kind of numbness gripped her nerves. There were wooden forms in this room, and a blackboard, on which 2 rows of figures had been set one beneath the other, but not yet added up. The silence, at first, was almost deathly. Then it was broken by a sound as if a heavy door banged, and the shuffling tramp of marching men. Louder, louder, softer. A word of command, still softer, and it died away. Dead silence again. Nedda pressed her hands to her breast. Twice she added up those figures on the blackboard. Each time the number was the same. Ah, there was a fly, 2 flies. How nice they looked, moving, chasing each other in the air. Did flies get into the cells? Perhaps not even a fly came there. Nothing more living than walls and wood. Nothing living except what was inside oneself. How dreadful! Not even a clock ticking, not even a bird's song. Silent, unliving, worse than in this room. Something pressed against her leg. She started violently and looked down. A little cat. Oh, what a blessed thing! A little sandy, ugly cat. It must have crept in through the door. She was not locked in then, anyway. Thus far had nerves carried her already. Scratching the little cat's furry pate, she pulled herself together. She would not tremble and be nervous. It was disloyal to Derek and to her purpose, which was to bring comfort to poor Trist. Then the door was pushed open, and the warder said, "Quarter of an hour, miss. I'll be just outside." She saw a big man with unshaven cheeks come in, and stretched out her hand. "I am Mr. Derek's cousin, going to be married to him. He's been ill, but he's getting well again now. We knew you'd like to hear." And she thought, "Oh, what a tragic face. I can't bear to look at his eyes." He took her hand, said, "Thank you, miss," and stood as still as ever. "Please come and sit down, and we can talk." Trist moved to a form and took his seat thereon with his hands between his knees, as if playing with an imaginary cap. He was dressed in an ordinary suit of labourer's best clothes, and his stiff, dust-coloured hair was not cut particularly short. The cheeks of his square-cut face had fallen in, the eyes had sunk back, and the prominence thus given to his cheek and jawbones and thick mouth gave his face a savage look. Only his dog-like, terribly yearning eyes made Nedda feel so sorry that she simply could not feel afraid. "The children are such dears, Mr. Trist. Biddy seems to grow every day. They're no trouble at all, and quite happy. Biddy's wonderful with them." "She's a good maid." The thick lips shaped the words as though they had almost lost power of speech. "Do they let you see the newspapers we send? Have you got everything you want?" For a minute he did not seem to be going to answer. Then, moving his head from side to side, he said, "Nothing I want, but just get out of here." Nedda murmured helplessly, "It's only a month now to the assizes. Does Mr. Pogram come to see you?" "Yes, he comes. He can't do nothing." "Oh, don't despair. Even if they don't acquit you, it'll soon be over. Don't despair." And she stole her hand out and timidly touched his arm. She felt her heart turning over and over, he looked so sad. He said in that stumbling, thick voice, "Thank you kindly. I must get out. I won't stand long of it, not much longer. I'm not used to it. Always been accustomed to the air and being about, that's where it is. But don't you tell him, miss. You say I'm going along all right. Don't you tell him what I said. There's no use him fretting over me. 'Twon't do me no good." And Nana murmured, No, I won't tell him." Then suddenly came the words she had dreaded. "Do you think they'll let me go, miss?" "Oh, yes, I think so. I hope so." But she could not meet his eyes, and hearing him grit his boot on the floor, knew he had not believed her. He said slowly, "I never meant to do it when I went out that morning. It came on me sudden, looking at the straw." Nedda gave a little gasp. Could that man outside hear? Tris went on. "If they don't let me go, I won't stand it. 'Tis too much for a man. I can't sleep, I can't eat, nor nothing. I won't stand it. Don't take long to die if you put your mind to it." Feeling quite sick with pity, Nedda got up and stood beside him, and moved by an uncontrollable impulse, she lifted one of his great hands and clasped it in both her own. "Oh, try and be brave and look forward. You're going to be ever so happy some day." He gave her a strange, long stare. "Yes, I'll be happy some day. Don't you never fret about me." And Nedda saw that the warder was standing in the doorway. "Sorry, miss, time's up." Without a word, Trist rose and went out. Nedda was alone again with the little sandy cat. Standing under the high-barred window, she wiped her cheeks that were all wet. Why must people suffer so slowly, so horribly? What were men made of? They could go on day after day, year after year, watching others suffer? When the warder came back to take her out, she did not trust herself to speak or even to look at him. She walked with hands tight-clenched and eyes fixed on the ground. Outside the prison door she drew a long, long breath. And suddenly her eyes caught the inscription on the corner of a lane leading down alongside the prison wall. Love's Walk. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 33. Peremptorily ordered by the doctor to the sea, but with instructions to avoid for the present all excitement, sunlight, and colour, Derek and his grandmother repaired to a spot well known to be grey, and Nedda went home to Hampstead. This was the last week in July. A fortnight spent in the perfect vacuity of an English watering place restored the boy wonderfully. No one could be better trusted than Francis Freeland to preserve him from looking on the dark side of anything, more especially when that thing was already not quite nice. Their conversation was therefore free from allusion to the labourers, the strike, or Bob Trist, and Derek thought the more. The approaching trial was hardly ever out of his mind. Bathing, he would think of it. Sitting on the grey jetty looking over the grey sea, he would think of it. Up the grey cobbled streets and away on the headlands, he would think of it. And so as not to have to think of it, he would try to walk himself to a standstill. Unfortunately, the head will continue working when the legs are at rest. And when he sat opposite her at meal-times, Francis Freeland would gaze piercingly at his forehead and muse, "The dear boy looks much better, but he's getting a little line between his brows. It is such a pity." It worried her, too, that the face he was putting on their little holiday together was not quite as full as she would have wished. Though the last thing in the world she could tolerate were really fat cheeks, those signs of all that her stoicism abhorred, those truly unforgivable marks of the loss of form. He struck her as dreadfully silent, too, and she would rack her brains for subjects that would interest him, often saying to herself, "If only I were clever." It was natural he should think of dear Nedda, but surely it was not that which gave him the little line. He must be brooding about those other things. He ought not to be melancholy like this, and let anything prevent the sea from doing him good. The habit, hard learned by the old, and especially the old of her particular sex, of not wishing for the moon, or at all events of not letting others know that you are wishing for it, had long enabled Francis Freeland to talk cheerfully on the most indifferent subjects, whether or no her heart were aching. One's heart often did ache, of course, but it simply didn't do to let it interfere, making things uncomfortable for others. And once she said to him, "You know, darling, I think it would be so nice for you to take a little interest in politics. They're very absorbing when you once get into them. I find my paper most enthralling, and it really has very good principles." "If politics did anything for those who most need things done, Granny, but I can't see that they do." She thought a little, then, making firm her lips, said, "I don't think that's quite just, darling. There are a great many politicians who are very much looked up to, All the bishops, for instance, and others whom nobody could suspect of self-seeking. I didn't mean that politicians were self-seeking, Granny. I meant that they are comfortable people, and the things that interest them are those that interest comfortable people. What have they done for the labourers, for instance? Oh, but darling, they're going to do a great deal. In my paper they're continually saying that. Do you believe it? I'm sure they wouldn't say so if they weren't. There's quite a new plan, and it sounds most sensible. And so I don't think, darling, that if I were you, I should make myself unhappy about all that kind of thing. They must know best. They're all so much older than you, and you're getting quite a little line between your eyes. Derek smiled. All right, Granny, I shall have a big one soon. Frances Freeland smiled too, but shook her head. Yes, and that's why I really think you ought to take interest in politics. I'd rather take interest in you, Granny. You're very jolly to look at. Frances Freeland raised her brows. I? My dear, I'm a perfect fright nowadays. Thus pushing away what her stoicism and perpetual aspiration to an impossibly good face would not suffer her to admit, she added, Where would you like to drive this afternoon? For they took drives in a small victoria, Frances Freeland holding her sunshade to protect him from the sun whenever it made the mistake of being out. On August the 4th he insisted that he was well and must go back home. And though to bring her attendance on him to an end was a grief, she humbly admitted that he must be wanting younger company, and after one wistful attempt made no further bones. The following day they travelled. On getting home he found that the police had been to see little Biddy Trist, who was to be called as a witness. Tod would take her over on the morning of the trial. Derek did not wait for this, but on the day before the assizes repacked his bag and went off to the Royal Charles Hostel at Worcester. He slept not at all that night, and next morning was early at the court, for Trist's case would be the first. Anxiously he sat watching all the queer and formal happenings that marked the initiation of the higher justice. The assemblage of the gentlemen in wigs, the sifting, shifting, settling of clerks and ushers, solicitors, and the public, the busy indifference, the cheerful professionalism of it all. He saw little Mr. Pogram come in, more square and rubbery than ever, and engage in conclave with one of the bewigged. The smiles, shrugs, even the sharp expressions on that barrister's face, the way he stood, twisting round, one hand wrapped in his gown, one foot on the bench behind. It was all as if he had done it hundreds of times before, and cared not the snap of one of his thin yellow fingers. Then there was a sudden hush. The judge came in, bowed, and took his seat. And that too seemed so professional. Haunted by the thought of him to whom this was almost life and death, the boy was incapable of seeing how natural it was that they should not at all feel as he did. The case was called, and Trist brought in. Derek had once more to undergo the torture of those tragic eyes fixed on him. Round that heavy figure, that mournful, half-brutal and half-yearning face, the pleadings, the questions, the answers buzzed, bringing out facts with damning clearness, yet leaving the real story of that early morning as hidden as if the court and all were but gibbering figures of air. The real story of Trist, heavy and distraught, rising and turning out from habit into the early haze on the fields where his daily work had lain, of Trist brooding with the slow, the wrathful incoherence that centuries of silence in those lonely fields had passed into the blood of his forebears and himself. Brooding in the dangerous disproportion that enforced continence brings to certain natures, loading the brain with violence till the storm bursts and there leaps out the lurid dark insanities of crime. Brooding while in the air flies chased each other, insects crawled together in the grass, and the first principle of nature worked everywhere its sane fulfilment. They might talk and take evidence as they would, be shrewd and sharp with all the petty sharpness of the law, but the secret springs would still lie undisclosed, too natural and true to bear the light of day. The probings and eloquence of justice would never paint the picture of that moment of maniacal relief, when, with jaw hanging loose, eyes bulging in exultation of revenge, he'd struck those matches with his hairy hands and let them flare in the straw, till the little red flames ran and licked, rustled and licked, and there was nothing to do but watch them lick and burn. Nor of that sudden wildness of dumb fear that rushed into the heart of the crouching creature, changing the madness of his face to palsy, nor of the recoil from the burning stack, those moments empty with terror, nor of how terror, through habit of inarticulate emotionless existence, gave place again to brute stolidity. And so, heavily back across the dewy fields, under the lark's songs, the cooings of pigeons, the hum of wings, and all the unconscious rhythm of ageless nature. No, the probings of justice could never reach the whole truth. And even justice quailed at its own probings when the mother-child was passed up from Tod's side into the witness box, and the big labourer was seen to look at her, and she at him. She seemed to have grown taller. Her pensive little face and beautifully fluffed-out corn-brown hair had an eerie beauty perched up there in the arid witness box, as of some small figure from the brush of Botticelli. "Your name, my dear?" "Biddy Trist." "How old?" 10 next month, please." "Do you remember going to live at Mr. Freeland's cottage?" "Yes, sir." "And do you remember the first night?" "Yes, sir." "Where did you sleep, Biddy?" "Please, sir, we slept in a big room with a screen, Billy and Susie and me, and father behind the screen." "And where was the room?" "Downstairs, sir." "Now, Biddy, what time did you wake up the first morning?" "When father got up." "Was that early or late?" "Very early." "Would you know the time?" "No, sir." "But it was very early. How did you know that?" "It was a long time before we had any breakfast." "And what time did you have breakfast?" 6:30 by the kitchen clock." "Was it light when you woke up?" "Yes, sir." "When father got up, did he dress or did he go to bed again?" "He hadn't never undressed, sir." "Then did he stay with you or did he go out?" "Out, sir." "And how long was it before he came back?" "When I was putting on Billy's boots." "What had you done in between?" "Helped Susie and dressed Billy." "And how long does that take you generally?" "Half an hour, sir." "I see. What did father look like when he came in, Biddy?" The mother-child paused. For the first time it seemed to dawn on her that there was something dangerous in these questions. She twisted her small hands before her and gazed at her father. The judge said gently, "Well, my child?" "Like he does now, sir." "Thank you, Biddy." That was all. The mother-child was suffered to step down and take her place again by Tod. And in the silence rose the short and rubbery report of little Mr. Pogram blowing his nose. No evidence given that morning was so conclusive, actual, terrible, as that unconscious, "Like he does now, sir." That was why even justice quailed a little at its own probings. From this moment the boy knew that Trist's fate was sealed. What did all those words matter, those professional patterings one way and the other, the professional jeers, "My friend has told you this, and my friend will tell you that," the professional steering of the impartial judge, sitting there above them all, the cold, calculated rhapsodies about the heinousness of arson, the cold and calculated attack on the characters of the stone-breaker witness and the tramp witness, the cold and calculated patter of the appeal not to condemn a father on the evidence of his little child, the cold and calculated outburst on the right of every man to be assumed innocent, except on overwhelming evidence such as did not here exist, the cold and calculated balancing of pro and con, and those minutes of cold calculation veiled from the eyes of the court. Even the verdict, guilty, even the judgment, 3 years penal servitude. All nothing, all superfluity to the boy supporting the tragic gaze of Trist's eyes and making up his mind to a desperate resort. 3 years penal servitude. The big labourer paid no more attention to those words than to any others spoken during that hour's settlement of his fate. True, he received them standing, as is the custom, fronting the image of justice, from whose lips they came. But by no single gesture did he let anyone see the dumb depths of his soul. If life had taught him nothing else, it had taught him never to express himself. Mute as any bullock led into the slaughtering-house, with something of a bullock's dulled and helpless fear in his eyes, he passed down and away between his jailers. And at once the professional noises rose, and the professional rhapsodists, hunching their gowns, swept that little lot of papers into their pink tape, and, turning to their neighbours, smiled and talked and jerked their eyebrows. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 34. The nest on the Spaniards' Road had not been able to contain Sheila long. There are certain natures, such as that of Felix, to whom the claims and exercise of authority are abhorrent, who refuse to exercise it themselves and rage when they see it exercised over others, but who somehow never come into actual conflict with it. There are other natures, such as Sheila's, who do not mind in the least exercising authority themselves, but who oppose it vigorously when they feel it coming near themselves or some others. Of such is the kingdom of militancy. Her experience with the police had sunk deep into her soul. They had not, as a fact, treated her at all badly, which did not prevent her feeling as if they had outraged in her the dignity of woman. She arrived, therefore, in Hampstead, seeing red even where red was not. And since undoubtedly much real red was to be seen, there was little other colour in the world or in her cheeks those days. Long disagreements with Alan, to whom she was still a magnet, but whose Stanley-like nature stood firm against the blandishments of her revolting tongue, drove her more and more towards a decision the seeds of which had perhaps been planted during her former stay among the breezy airs of Hampstead. Felix, coming one day into his wife's study, for the house knew not the word drawing-room, found Flora, with eyebrows lifted up and smiling lips, listening to Sheila, proclaiming the doctrine that it was impossible not to live on one's own. Nothing else, Felix learned, was compatible with dignity, or even with peace of mind. She had therefore taken a back room high up in a back street, in which she was going to live perfectly well on 10 shillings a week, and, having £32 saved up, she would be all right for a year, after which she would be able to earn her living. The principle she proposed to keep before her eyes was that of committing herself to nothing which would seriously interfere with her work in life. Somehow it was impossible to look at this girl, with her glowing cheeks and her glowing eyes and her hair frizzy from ardour, and to distrust her utterances. Yes, she would arrive, if not where she wanted, at all events somewhere, which after all was the great thing. And in fact she did arrive the very next day in the back room high up in the back street, and neither Tod's cottage nor the house on the Spaniards' Road saw more than flying gleams of her thenceforth. Another by-product this of that little starting episode, the notice given to Trist. Strange how in life one little incident, one little piece of living stress, can attract and gather round it the feelings, thoughts, actions of people whose lives run far and wide away therefrom. But episodes are thus potent only when charged with the significance that comes from the clash of the deepest instincts. During the 6 weeks which had elapsed between his return home from Joyfields and the assizes, Felix had much leisure to reflect that if Lady Mallering had not caused Trist to be warned that he could not marry his deceased wife's sister and continue to stay on the estate, the lives of Felix himself, his daughter, mother, brother, brother's wife, their son and daughter, and in less degree of his other brothers, would have been free of a preoccupation little short of ludicrous in proportion to the face value of the cause. But he had leisure, too, to reflect that in reality the issue involved in that tiny episode concerned human existence to its depths. For what was it but the simple, all-important question of human freedom? The simple, all-important issue of how far men and women should try to rule the lives of others instead of trying only to rule their own, and how far those others should allow their lives to be so ruled. This it was which gave that episode its power of attracting and affecting the thoughts, feelings, actions of so many people otherwise remote. And though Felix was paternal enough to say to himself nearly all the time, "I can't let Nedda get further into this mess," he was philosopher enough to tell himself, in the unfatherly balance of his hours, that the mess was caused by the fight best of all worth fighting, of democracy against autocracy, of a man's right to do as he likes with his life if he harms no others, of the land against the fetterers of the land. and he was artist enough to see how from that little starting episode the whole business had sprung, given, of course, the entrance of the willful force called love. But a father, especially when he has been thoroughly alarmed, gives the artist and philosopher in him short shrift. Nedda came home soon after Sheila went, and to the eyes of Felix she came back too old and thoughtful altogether. How different a girl from the Nedda who had so wanted to know everything that first night of May. What was she brooding over, what planning in that dark, round, pretty head? At what resolve were those clear eyes so swiftly raised to look? What was going on within when her breast heaved so without seeming cause, and the colour rushed up to in her cheeks at a word, as though she had been so far away that the effort of recall was alone enough to set all her veins throbbing? And yet Felix could devise no means of attack on her infatuation. For a man cannot cultivate the habit of never interfering and then suddenly throw it over, least of all when the person to be interfered with is his pet and only daughter. Flora, not of course in the swim of those happenings at Joyfields, could not be got to take the matter very seriously. In fact, beyond what concerned Felix himself and poetry, the matter that she did take seriously had yet to be discovered. Hers was one of those semi-detached natures particularly found in Hampstead. When exhorted to help tackle the question, she could only suggest that Felix should take them all abroad when he had finished the last of the labourers. A tour, for instance, in Norway and Sweden, where none of them had ever been, and perhaps down through Finland into Russia. Feeling like one who squirts on a burning haystack with a garden syringe, Felix propounded this scheme to his little daughter. She received it with a start, a silence, a sort of quivering all over, as of an animal who scents danger. She wanted to know when, and being told, not before the middle of August, relapsed into her preoccupation as if nothing had been said. Felix noted on the hall table one afternoon a letter in her handwriting addressed to a Worcester newspaper, and remarked thereafter that she began to receive this journal daily, obviously with a view to reports of the coming assizes. Once he tried to break through into her confidence. It was August Bank Holiday, and they had gone out onto the heath together to see the people wonderfully assembled. Coming back across the burnt-up grass, strewn with paper bags, banana peel, and the cores of apples, he hooked his hand into her arm. "What is to be done with a child that goes about all day thinking and not telling anybody what she is thinking?" She smiled round at him and answered, "I know, Dad. She is a pig, isn't she?" Bill's stubbornness was not encouraging. Then his hand was squeezed to her side, and he heard her murmur, "I wonder if all daughters are such beasts." He understood well that she had meant, "There's only one thing I want, one thing I mean to have, one thing in the world for me now." And he said soberly, "We can't expect anything else." "Oh, Daddy," she answered, but nothing more. Only 4 days later she came to his study with a letter, and a face so flushed and troubled that he dropped his pen and got up in alarm. "Read this, Dad. It's impossible. It's not true. It's terrible. What am I to do?" The letter ran thus, in a straight, boyish handwriting. Royal Charles Hostel, Worcester, August the 7th. My Nedda, I've just seen Bob tried. They've given him 3 years penal. It was awful to sit there and watch him. He can never stand it. It was awful to watch him looking at me. It's no good. I'm going to give myself up. I must do it. I've got everything ready. They'll have to believe me and squash his sentence. You see, but for me it would never have been done. It's a matter of honour. I can't let him suffer any more. This isn't impulse. I've been meaning to do it for some time if they found him guilty. So in a way it's an immense relief. I'd like to have seen you first, but it would only distress you, and I might not have been able to go through with it after. Nedda, darling, if you still love me when I get out, we'll go to New Zealand, away from this country where they bully poor creatures like Bob. Be brave. I'll write tomorrow if they let me. Your Derek. The first sensation in Felix on reading this effusion was poignant recollection of the little lawyer's look after Derek had made the scene at Trist's committal, and of his words, "Nothing in it, is there?" His second thought, "Is this the cutting of the knot that I've been looking for?" His third, which swept all else away, My poor little darling, what business has that boy to hurt you again like this? He heard her say, Tris told me himself he did it, Dad. He told me when I went to see him in the prison. Honour doesn't demand what isn't true. Oh, Dad, help me. Felix was slow in getting free from the cross-currents of reflection. He wrote this last night, he said dismally. He may have done it already. We must go and see John. Nedda clasped her hands. Ah, yes. And Felix had not the heart to add what he was thinking. Not that I can see what good he can do. But though sober reason told him this, it was astonishingly comforting to be going to someone who could be relied on to see the facts of the situation without any of that flim-flam with which imagination is accustomed to surround them. And we'll send Derek a wire for what it's worth. They went at once to the post office. Felix composing this message on the way. Utterly mistaken chivalry, you have no right, await our arrival. Felix Freeland. He handed it to her to read, and passed it under the brass railing to the clerk, not without the feeling of shame due from one who uses the word chivalry in a post office. On the way to the tube station he held her arm tightly, but whether to impart courage or receive it he could not have said, so strung up in spirit did he feel her. With few words exchanged they reached Whitehall. Marking their card urgent, they were received within 10 minutes. John was standing in a high white room, smelling a little of papers and tobacco, and garnished solely by 5 green chairs, a table, and a bureau with an immense number of pigeonholes, whereat he had obviously been seated. Quick to observe what concerned his little daughter, Felix noted how her greeting trembled up at her uncle, and how a sort of warmth thawed for the moment the regularity of his brother's face. When they had taken 2 of the 5 green chairs, and John was back at his bureau, Felix handed over the letter. John read it and looked at Nedda. Then, taking a pipe out of his pocket, which he'd evidently filled before they came in, he lighted it and reread the letter. Then, looking very straight at Nedda, he said, Nothing in it. Honour bright, my dear. No, Uncle John, nothing. Only that he fancies his talk about injustice put it into Tris's head. John nodded. The girl's face was evidence enough for him. Any proof? Tris himself told me in the prison that he did it. He said it came on him suddenly when he saw the straw. A pause followed before John said, Good. You and I and your father will go down and see the police. Nedda lifted her hands and said breathlessly, But, Uncle, Dad, have I the right? He says honour. Won't it be betraying him? Felix could not answer, but with relief he heard John say, It's not honourable to cheat the law. No, but he trusted me or he wouldn't have written. John answered slowly, I think your duty is plain, my dear. The question for the police will be whether or not to take notice of this false confession. For us to keep the knowledge that it's false from them, under the circumstances, is clearly not right. Besides being, to my mind, foolish. For Felix to watch this mortal conflict going on in the soul of his daughter, that soul which used to seem, perhaps even now seemed, part of himself, to know that she so desperately wanted help for her decision, and to be unable to give it, unable even to trust himself to be honest, this was hard for Felix. There she sat, staring before her, and only her tight-clasped hands, the little movements of her lips and throat, showed the struggle going on in her. I couldn't without seeing him. I must see him first, Uncle. John got up and went over to the window. He too had been affected by her face. You realize, he said, that you risk everything by that, if he's given himself up and they believed him. He's not the sort to let it fall through. You cut off your chance if he won't let you tell. Better for your father and me to see him first, anyway. And Felix heard a mutter that sounded like, Confound him. Nedda rose. Can we go at once then, Uncle? With a solemnity that touched Felix, John put a hand on each side of her face, raised it, and kissed her on the forehead. All right, he said. Let's be off. A silent trio sought Paddington in a taxicab, digesting this desperate climax of an affair that sprang from origins so small. In Felix, contemplating his daughter's face, there was profound compassion, but also that family dismay, that perturbation of self-esteem, which public scandal forces on kinsmen, even the most philosophic. He felt exasperation against Derek, against Kirsteen, almost even against Tod, for having acquiesced passively in the revolutionary bringing up which had brought on such a disaster. War against injustice, sympathy without suffering, chivalry. Yes, but not quite to the point whence they recoiled on his daughter, his family, himself. The situation was impossible. He was fast resolving that, whether or no they saved Derek from his quixotry, the boy should not have Nedda. And already his eyes found difficulty in meeting hers. They secured a compartment to themselves, and having settled down in corners, began mechanically unfolding evening journals. For after all, whatever happens, one must read the papers. Without that, life would indeed be insupportable. Felix had bought Mr. Cuthbert's, but though he turned and turned the sheets, they seemed to have no sense till these words caught his eyes. Convict's tragic death. Yesterday afternoon at Worcester, while being conveyed from the assize court back to prison, a man named Trist, sentenced to 3 years penal servitude for arson, suddenly attacked the warders in charge of him and escaped. He ran down the street, hotly pursued, and darting out into the traffic, threw himself under a motor car going at some speed. The car struck him on the head, and the unfortunate man was killed on the spot. No reason whatever can be assigned for this desperate act. He is known, however, to have suffered from epilepsy, and it is thought an attack may have been coming on him at the time. When Felix had read these words, he remained absolutely still, holding that buff-coloured paper before his face, trying to decide what he must do now. What was the significance, exactly the significance of this? Now that Tris was dead, Derek's quixotic action had no meaning. But had he already confessed? It seemed from this account that the suicide was directly after the trial, even before the boy's letter to Nedda had been written. He must surely have heard of it since and given up his mad idea. He leaned over, touched John on the knee, and handed him the paper. John read the paragraph, handed it back, and the two brothers stared fixedly at each other. Then Felix made the faintest movement of his head towards his daughter, and John nodded. Crossing to Nedda, Felix hooked his arm in hers and said, "Just look at this, my child." Nedda read, started to her feet, sank back, and cried out, "Poor, poor man! Oh, Dad, poor man!" Felix felt ashamed. Though Trist's death meant so much relief to her, she felt first this rush of compassion. He himself, to whom it meant so much less relief, had felt only that relief. "He said he couldn't stand it. He told me that, but I never thought, oh, poor man." And burying her face against his arm, she gave way. Petrified, and conscious that John at the far end of the carriage was breathing rather hard, Felix could only stroke her arm, till at last she whispered, "There's nobody now for Derek to save. Oh, if you'd seen that poor man in prison, Dad." And the only words of comfort Felix could find were, "My child, there are thousands and thousands of poor prisoners and captives." In a truce to agitation they spent the rest of that 3 hours' journey, while the train rattled and rumbled through the quiet, happy-looking land. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 35. It was tea-time when they reached Worcester, and at once went up to the Royal Charles Hostel. A pretty young woman in the office there informed them that the young gentleman had paid his bill and gone out about 10 o'clock, but had left his luggage. She had not seen him come in. His room was up that little staircase at the end of the passage. There was another entrance that he might have come in at. The boots would take them. Past the hall stuffed with furniture and decorated with the stag's heads and battle prints common to English county-town hotels, they followed the boots up 5 red-carpeted steps, down a dingy green corridor, to a door at the very end. There was no answer to their knock. The dark little room with striped walls and more battle prints looked out on a side street and smelled dusty. On a shiny leather sofa, an old valise, strapped up ready for departure, was reposing with Felix's telegram, unopened, deposited thereon. Writing on his card, "Have come down with Nedda, FF," and laying it on the telegram, in case Derek should come in by the side entrance, Felix and Nedda rejoined John in the hall. To wait in anxiety is perhaps the hardest thing in life. Tea, tobacco, and hot baths perhaps the only anodynes. These, except the baths, they took. Without knowing what had happened, neither John nor Felix liked to make inquiry at the police station, nor did they care to try and glean knowledge from the hotel people by questions that might lead to gossip. They could but kick their heels till it became reasonably certain that Derek was not coming back. The enforced waiting increased Felix's exasperation. Everything Derek did seemed designed to cause Nedda pain. To watch her sitting there, trying resolutely to mask her anxiety, became intolerable. At last he got up and said to John, "I think we'd better go round there." And John, nodding, he added, "Wait here, my child. One of us will come back at once and tell you anything we hear." She gave them a grateful look, and the two brothers went out. They had not gone 20 yards when they met Derek, striding along, pale, wild, unhappy-looking. When Felix touched him on the arm, he started and stared blankly at his uncle. "We've seen about Trist," Felix said. "You've not done anything?" Derek shook his head. "Good. John, tell Nedda that and stay with her a bit. I want to talk to Derek. We'll go in the other way." He put his hand under the boy's arm and turned him down into the side street. When they reached the gloomy little bedroom, Felix pointed to the telegram. "From me. I suppose the news of his death stopped you?" "Yes." Derek opened the telegram, dropped it, and sat down beside his valise on the shiny sofa. He looked positively haggard. Taking his stand against the chest of drawers, Felix said quietly, "I'm going to have it out with you, Derek. Do you understand what all this means to Nedda? Do you realize how utterly unhappy you're making her? I don't suppose you're happy yourself." The boy's whole figure writhed. "Happy? When you've killed someone you don't think much of happiness, your own or anyone's." Startled in his turn, Felix said sharply, "Don't talk like that, it's monomania." Derek laughed. "Bob Trist's dead, through me. I can't get out of that." Gazing at the boy's tortured face, Felix grasped the gruesome fact that this idea amounted to obsession. "Derek," he said, "you've dwelt on this till you see it out of all proportion. If we took to ourselves the remote consequences of all our words, we should none of us survive a week. You're overdone. You'll see it differently tomorrow." Derek got up to pace the room. "I swear I would have saved him. I tried to do it when they committed him at Transham." He looked wildly at Felix. "Didn't I? You were there. You heard." Yes, I heard. "They wouldn't let me then. I thought they mightn't find him guilty here, so I let it go on. And now he's dead. You don't know how I feel." His throat was working, and Felix said with real compassion, "My dear boy, your sense of honour is too extravagant altogether. A grown man like poor Trist knew perfectly what he was doing." "No, he was like a dog. He did what he thought was expected of him. I never meant him to burn those ricks." "Exactly. No one can blame you for a few wild words. He might have been the boy, and you the man, by the way you take it. Come." Derek sat down again on the shiny sofa and buried his head in his hands. "I can't get away from him. He's been with me all day. I see him all the time." That the boy was really haunted was only too apparent. How to attack this mania? If one could make him feel something else. And Felix said, "Look here, Derek. Before you've any right to Nedda, you've got to find ballast. That's a matter of honour, if you like." Derek flung up his head as if to escape a blow. Seeing that he had riveted him, Felix pressed on with some sternness. "A man can't serve two passions. You must give up this championing the weak and lighting flames you can't control. See what it leads to. You've got to grow and become a man. Until then I don't trust my daughter to you." The boy's lips quivered. A flush darkened his face, ebbed, and left him paler than ever. Felix felt as if he'd hit that face. Still, anything was better than to leave him under this gruesome obsession. Then, to his consternation, Derek stood up and said, "If I go and see his body at the prison, perhaps he'll leave me alone a little." Catching at that, as he would have caught at anything, Felix said, "Good, yes, go and see the poor fellow. We'll come too." And he went out to find Nedda. By the time they reached the street, Derek had already started, and they could see him going along in front. Felix racked his brains to decide whether he ought to prepare her for the state the boy was in. Twice he screwed himself up to take the plunge, but her face, puzzled as though wondering at her lover's neglect of her, stopped him. Better say nothing. Just as they reached the prison, she put her hand on his arm. "Look, Dad." And Felix read on the corner of the prison lane those words, "Love's Walk." Derek was waiting at the door. After some difficulty they were admitted and taken down the corridor where the prisoner on his knees had stared up at Nedda, past the courtyard where those others had been pacing out their living hieroglyphic, up steps to the hospital. Here, in a whitewashed room on a narrow bed, the body of the big labourer lay, wrapped in a sheet. "We'll bury him Friday, poor chap. Fine big man, too." And at the warder's words a shudder passed through Felix, the frozen tranquillity of that body. As the carved beauty of great buildings, so is the graven beauty of death, the unimaginable wonder of the abandoned thing, lying so quiet, marvelling at its resemblance to what once lived. How strange this thing, still stamped by all that it had felt, wanted, loved, and hated, by all its dumb, hard, commonplace existence. This thing with the calm, pathetic look of one who asks of his own fled spirit, "Why have you abandoned me?" Death. What more wonderful than a dead body, that still perfect work of life for which life has no longer use? What more mysterious than this sight of what still is, yet is not? Below the linen swathing the injured temples, those eyes were closed through which such yearning had looked forth. From that face, where the hair had grown faster than if it had been alive, death's majesty had planed away the aspect of brutality, removed the yearning, covered all with wistful acquiescence. Was his departed soul coherent? Where was it? Did it hover in this room, visible still to the boy? Did it stand there beside what was left of Tris the labourer, that humblest of all creatures who dared to make revolt? Serf, descendant of serfs, who since the beginning had hewn wood, drawn water, and done the will of others? Or was it winged and calling in space to the souls of the oppressed? This body would go back to the earth that it had tended. The wild grass would grow over it, the seasons spend wind and rain forever above it. But that which had held this together, the inarticulate, lowly spirit, hardly asking itself why things should be, faithful as a dog to those who were kind to it, obeying the dumb instinct of a violence that in his betters would be called high spirit. Where, Felix wondered, where was it? And what were they thinking, Nedda and that haunted boy, so motionless? Nothing showed on their faces, nothing but a sort of living concentration, as if they were trying desperately to pierce through and see whatever it was that held this thing before them in such awful stillness. Their first glimpse of death, their first perception of that terrible remoteness of the dead. No wonder they seemed to be conjured out of the power of thought and feeling. Nedda was first to turn away. Walking back by her side, Felix was surprised by her composure. The reality of death had not been to her half so harrowing as the news of it. She said softly, "I'm glad to have seen him like that. Now I shall think of him at peace, not as he was that other time." Derek rejoined them, and they went in silence back to the hotel. But at the door she said, "Come with me to the cathedral, Derek. I can't go in yet." To Felix's dismay, the boy nodded, and they turned to go. Should he stop them? Should he go with them? What should a father do? And with a heavy sigh, he did nothing but retire into the hotel. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 36. It was calm, with a dark blue sky and a golden moon, and the lighted street full of people out for airing. The great cathedral, cutting the heavens with its massive towers, was shut. No means of getting in, and while they stood there looking up, the thought came into Nedda's mind, where would they bury poor Trist who had killed himself? Would they refuse to bury that unhappy one in a churchyard? Surely the most unhappy and desperate he was, the kinder they ought to be to him. They turned away down into a little lane, where an old white-timbered cottage presided ghostly at the corner. Some church magnate had his garden back there, and it was quiet along the waving line of a high wall, behind which grew sycamores spreading close-bunched branches, whose shadows in the light of the corner lamps lay thick along the ground this glamorous August night. A chafer buzzed by. A small black cat played with its tail on some steps in a recess. Nobody passed. The girl's heart was beating fast. Derek's face was so strange and strained, and he had not yet said one word to her. All sorts of fears and fancies beset her till she was trembling all over. "What is it?" she said at last. You haven't stopped loving me, Derek." "No one could stop loving you." "What is it then? Are you thinking of poor Trist?" With a catch in his throat and a sort of choked laugh, he answered, "Yes." "But it's all over. He's at peace." "Peace?" Then in a queer, dead voice he added, "I'm sorry, Nedda. It's beastly for you, but I can't help it." What couldn't he help? Why did he keep her suffering like this, not telling her? What was this something that seemed so terribly between them? She walked on silently at his side, conscious of the rustling of the sycamores, of the moonlit angle of the church magnate's house, of the silence in the lane, and the gliding of their own shadows along the wall. What was this in his face, his thoughts, that she could not reach? And she cried out, "Tell me! Oh, tell me, Derek! I can go through anything with you." "I can't get rid of him, that's all. I thought he'd go when I'd seen him there. But it's no good." Terror got hold of her then. She peered at his face, very white and haggard. There seemed no blood in it. They were going downhill now, along the blank wall of a factory. There was the river in front with the moonlight on it, and boats drawn up along the bank. From a chimney a scroll of black smoke was flung out across the sky, and a lighted bridge glowed above the water. They turned away from that, passing below the dark pile of the cathedral. Here couples still lingered on benches along the river bank, happy in the warm night under the August moon. And on they walked in that strange, miserable silence, past all those benches and couples, out on the river path by the fields, where the scent of haystacks and the freshness from the early stubbles and the grasses webbed with dew overpower the faint reek of the river mud. And still on and on in the moonlight that haunted through the willows. At their footsteps the water-rats scuttled down into the water with tiny splashes. A dog barked somewhere a long way off. A train whistled. A frog croaked. From the stubbles and second crops of sun-baked clover, puffs of warm air kept stealing up into the chillier air beneath the willows. Such moonlit nights never seemed to sleep. And there was a kind of triumph in the night's smile, as though it knew that it ruled the river and the fields, ruled with its gleams the silent trees that had given up all rustling. Suddenly Derek said, "He's walking with us. Look, over there." And for a second there did seem to Nedda a dim grey shape moving square and dogged parallel with them at the stubble edges. Gasping out, Oh, no, don't frighten me. I can't bear it tonight." She hid her face against his shoulder like a child. He put his arm round her, and she pressed her face deep into his coat. This ghost of Bob Trist holding him away from her, this enemy, this uncanny presence. She pressed closer, and put her face up to his. It was wonderfully lonely, silent, whispering, with the moonbeams slipping through the willow boughs into the shadow where they stood. And from his arms warmth stole through her. Closer and closer she pressed, not quite knowing what she did, not quite knowing anything, but that she wanted him never to let her go, wanted his lips on hers, so that it might feel his spirit pass, away from what was haunting it, into hers, never to escape. But his lips did not come to hers. They stayed drawn back, trembling, hungry-looking, just above her lips. And she whispered, "Kiss me." She felt him shudder in her arms, saw his eyes darken, his lips quiver and quiver, as if he wanted them to, but they would not. What was it? Oh, what was it? Wasn't he going to kiss her? Not to kiss her? And while in that unnatural pause they stood, their heads bent back among the moon-gleams and those willow shadows, there passed through Nedda such strange trouble as she had never known. Not kiss her? Not kiss her? Why didn't he? when in her blood and in the night all round, in the feel of his arms, the sight of his hungry lips, was something unknown, wonderful, terrifying, sweet. And she wailed out, "I want you. I don't care. I want you." She felt him sway, reel, and clutch her as if he were going to fall, and all other feeling vanished in the instinct of the nurse she had already been to him. He was ill again. Yes, he was ill. And she said, "Derek, don't. It's all right. Let's walk on quietly." She got his arm tightly in hers and drew him along toward home. By the jerking of that arm, the taunt look on his face, she could feel that he did not know from step to step whether he could stay upright. But she herself was steady and calm enough, bent on keeping emotion away, and somehow getting him back along the river path, abandoned now to the moon and the bright still spaces of the night and the slow-moving whitened water. Why had she not felt from the first that he was overwrought and only fit for bed? Thus, very slowly, they made their way up by the factory again, into the lane by the church magnate's garden, under the branches of the sycamores, past the same white-faced old house at the corner, to the high street, where some few people were still abroad. At the front door of the hotel stood Felix, looking at his watch, disconsolate as an old hen. To her great relief, he went in quickly when he saw them coming. She could not bear the thought of talk and explanation. The one thing was to get Derek to bed. All the time he had gone along with that taut face, and now when he sat down on the shiny sofa in the little bedroom, he shivered so violently that his teeth chattered. She rang for a hot bottle and brandy and hot water. When he had drunk, he certainly shivered less, professed himself all right, and would not let her stay. She dared not ask, but it did seem as if the physical collapse had driven away, for the time of all events, that ghostly visitor, and touching his forehead with her lips, very motherly, so that he looked up and smiled at her, she said in a matter-of-fact voice, "I'll come back after a bit and tuck you up," and went out. Felix was waiting in the hall, at a little table on which stood a bowl of bread and milk. He took the cover off it for her without a word, and while she supped he kept glancing at her, trying to make up his mind to words. But her face was sealed, and all he said was, "Your uncle's gone to Beckett for the night. I've got your room next mine, and a toothbrush and some sort of comb. I hope you'll be able to manage, my child." Nedda left him at the door of his room and went into her own. After waiting there 10 minutes, she stole out again. It was all quiet, and she went resolutely back down the stairs. She did not care who saw her or what they thought. Probably they took her for Derek's sister, but even if they didn't, she would not have cared. It was past 11, the light nearly out, and the hall in the condition of such places that await a morning's renovation. His corridor, too, was quite dark. She opened the door without sound and listened, till his voice said softly, "All right, little angel, I'm not asleep." And by a glimmer of moonlight, through curtains designed to keep out nothing, she stole up to the bed. She could just see his face, and eyes looking up at her with a sort of adoration. She put her hand on his forehead and whispered, "Are you comfy?" He murmured back, "Yes, quite comfy." Kneeling down, she laid her face beside his on the pillow. She could not help doing that. It made everything seem holy, cuddly, warm. His lips touched her nose. Her eyes, for just that instant, looked up into his, that were very dark and soft. Then she got up. "Would you like me to stay till you're asleep?" "Yes, forever. But I shouldn't exactly sleep. Would you?" In the darkness, Nedda vehemently shook her head. Sleep? No, she would not sleep. "Good night, then." "Good night, dark little angel." "Good night." With that last whisper, she slipped back to the door and noiselessly away. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 37. It was long before she closed her eyes, spending the hours in fancy where still less she would have slept. But when she did drop off, she dreamed that he and she were alone upon a star, where all the trees were white, The water, grass, birds, everything white, and they were walking arm in arm among white flowers. And just as she had stooped to pick one, it was no flower but Trist's white-banded face. She woke with a little cry. She was dressed by 8 and went at once to Derek's room. There was no answer to her knock, and in a flutter of fear she opened the door. He had gone, packed and gone. She ran back to the hall. There was a note for her in the office, and she took it out of sight to read. It said, "He came back this morning. I'm going home by the first train. He seems to want me to do something. Derek." Came back? That thing, that grey thing that she too had seemed to see for a moment in the fields beside the river, and he was suffering again as he had suffered yesterday? It was awful. She waited miserably till her father came down. To find that he too knew of this trouble was some relief. He made no objection when she begged that they should follow on to Joyfields. Directly after breakfast they set out. Once on her way to Derek again, she did not feel so frightened. But in the train she sat very still, gazing at her lap, and only once glanced up from under those long lashes. "Can you understand it, Dad?" Felix, not much happier than she, answered. The man had something queer about him. Besides Eric's being ill, don't forget that. But it's too bad for you, Nedda. I don't like it. I don't like it. I can't be parted from him, Dad. That's impossible. Felix was silenced by the vigour of those words. "His mother can help, perhaps," he said. Ha! If his mother would help, send him away from the labourers and all this. Up from the station they took the field paths, which cut off quite a mile. The grass and woods were shining brightly, peacefully in the sun. It seemed incredible that there should be heart-burnings about a land so smiling, that wrongs and miseries should haunt those who lived and worked in these bright fields. Surely in this earthly paradise the dwellers were enviable, well-nourished souls, sleek and happy as the pied cattle that lifted their inquisitive muzzles. Nedda tried to stroke the nose of one, greyish, blunt, moist, but the creature backed away from her hand, snuffling, and its cynical, soft eyes with chestnut lashes seemed warning the girl that she belonged to the breed that might be trusted to annoy. In the last fields before the Joyfields crossroads, they came up with a little square, tow-headed man without coat or cap, who had just driven some cattle in and was returning with his dog, at a dot here, dot there walk, as though still driving them. He gave them a look rather like that of the bullock Nedda had tried to stroke. She knew he must be one of the Mannering men, and longed to ask him questions. But he too looked shy and distrustful, as if he suspected that they wanted something out of him. She summoned up courage, however, to say, "Did you see about poor Bob Trist?" "I heard tell. He didn't like prison. They say prison takes the heart out of you. He didn't think of that." And the smile that twisted the little man's lips seemed to Nedda strange and cruel, as if he actually found pleasure in the fate of his fellow. All she could find to answer was, "Is that a good dog?" The little man looked down at the dog trotting alongside with drooped tail, and shook his head. "He no good with beasts. Won't touch 'em." Then looking up sidelong, he added surprisingly, "Master Freeland, he got a crack on the head, though." Again there was that satisfied resentment in his voice, and the little smile twisting his lips. Nedda felt more lost than ever. They parted at the crossroads and saw him looking back at them as they went up the steps to the wicket gate. Amongst a patch of early sunflowers, Tod, in shirt and trousers, was surrounded by his dog and the 3 small Trists, all apparently engaged in studying the biggest of the sunflowers, where a peacock butterfly and a bee were feeding, one on a gold petal, the other on the black heart. Nedda went quickly up to them and asked, "Has Nedda come, Uncle Tod?" Tod raised his eyes. He did not seem in the least surprised to see her, as if his sky were in the habit of dropping his relatives at 10 in the morning. "Gone out again," he said. Nedda made a sign towards the children. "Have you heard, Uncle Tod?" Tod nodded, and his blue eyes, staring above the children's heads, darkened. "Is Granny still here?" Again Tod nodded. Leaving Felix in the garden, Nedda stole upstairs and tapped on Francis Freeland's door. She, whose stoicism permitted her the one luxury of never coming down to breakfast, had just made it for herself over a little spirit lamp. She greeted Nedda with lifted eyebrows. "Oh, my darling, where have you come from? You must have my nice cocoa. Isn't this the most perfect lamp you ever saw? Did you ever see such a flame? Watch." She touched the spirit lamp, and what there was of flame died out. "Now, isn't that provoking? It's really a splendid thing, quite a new kind. I mean to get you one. Now drink your cocoa, it's beautifully hot." "I've had breakfast, Granny." Francis Freeland gazed at her doubtfully, then as a last resource began to sip the cocoa, of which in truth she was badly in want. "Granny, will you help me?" "Of course, darling. What is it?" "I do so want Derek to forget all about this terrible business." Francis Freeland, who had unscrewed the top of a little canister, answered, "Yes, dear, I quite agree. I'm sure it's best for him. Open your mouth and let me pop in one of these delicious little plasmon biscuits. They're perfect after travelling. Only," she added wistfully, "I'm afraid he won't pay any attention to me." "No, but you could speak to Aunt Kirsteen. It's for her to stop him." One of her most pathetic smiles came over Francis Freeland's face. "Yes, I could speak to her, but you see, I don't come for anything. One doesn't when one gets old." "Oh, Granny, you do. You come for a lot. Everyone admires you so. You always seem to have something that other people haven't got. And you're not a bit old in spirit." Francis Freeland was fingering her rings. She slipped one off. "Well," she said, "no good thinking about that, is it? I've wanted to give you this for ages, darling. It is so uncomfortable on my finger. Now just let me see if I can pop it on." Nedda recoiled. "Oh, Granny," she said, "you are—" and vanished. There was no one in the kitchen. She sat down to wait for her aunt to finish her upstairs duties. Kirsteen came down at last, in her inevitable blue dress, betraying her surprise at this sudden appearance of her niece only by a little quivering of her brows. And, trembling with nervousness, Nedda took her plunge, pouring out the whole story, of Derek's letter, of their journey down, her father's talk with him, the visit to Trist's body, their walk by the river, and of how haunted and miserable he was. Showing the little note he had left that morning, she clasped her hands and said, "Oh, Aunt Kirsteen, make him happy again. Stop that awful haunting and keep him from all this." Kirsteen had listened with one foot on the hearth in her favourite attitude. When the girl had finished, she said quietly, "I'm not a witch, Nedda." "But if it wasn't for you, he would never have started. And now that poor Trist's dead, he would leave it alone. I'm sure only you can make him lose that haunted feeling." Kirsteen shook her head. "Listen, Nedda," she said slowly, as though weighing each word. "I should like you to understand. There's a superstition in this country that people are free. Ever since I was a girl your age, I've known that they are not. No one is free here who can't pay for freedom. It's one thing to see, another to feel this with your whole being. When, like me, you have an open wound which something is always inflaming, you can't wonder, can you, that fever escapes into the air? Derek may have caught the infection of my fever, that's all. But I shall never lose that fever, Nedda. Never." "But, Aunt Kirsteen, this haunting is dreadful. I can't bear to see it." "My dear, Derek is very highly strung, and he's been ill. It's in my family to seize things. That'll go away." Nedda said passionately, "I don't believe he'll ever lose it while he goes on here, tearing his heart out. And they're trying to get me away from him. I know they are." Kirsteen turned. Her eyes seemed to blaze. "They? Ah, yes. You'll have to fight if you want to marry a rebel, Nedda." Nedda put her hands to her forehead, bewildered. "You see, Nedda, rebellion never ceases. It's not only against this or that injustice. It's against all force and wealth that takes advantage of its force and wealth. That rebellion goes on forever. Think well before you join in." Nedda turned away. Of what use to tell her to think when "I won't, I can't be parted from him," kept every other thought paralysed? And she pressed her forehead against the crossbar of the window, trying to find better words to make her appeal again. Out there above the orchard the sky was blue and everything light and gay, as the very butterflies that wavered past. A motor car seemed to have stopped in the road close by. Its whirring and whizzing was clearly audible, mingled with the cooings of pigeons and a robin's song. And suddenly she heard her aunt say, "You have your chance, Nedda. Here they are." Nedda turned. There in the doorway were her uncles John and Stanley coming in, followed by her father and Uncle Tod. What did this mean? What had they come for? And disturbed to the heart, she gazed from one to the other. They had that curious look of people not quite knowing what their reception would be like, yet with something resolute, almost portentous, in their mien. She saw John go up to her aunt and hold out his hand. "I dare say Felix and Nedda have told you about yesterday," he said. "Stanley and I thought it best to come over." Kirsteen answered, "Tod, will you tell Mother who's here?" Then none of them seemed to know quite what to say or where to look, till Frances Freeland, her face all pleased and anxious, came in. When she had kissed them, they all sat down, and Nedda, at the window, squeezed her hands tight together in her lap. "We've come about Derek," John said. "Yes," broke in Stanley. "For goodness sake, Kirsteen, don't let's have any more of this. Just think what would have happened yesterday if that poor fellow hadn't providentially gone off the hooks." "Providentially?" "Well, it was. You see to what lengths Derek was prepared to go? Hang it all! We shouldn't have been exactly proud of a felon in the family." Frances Freeland, who had been lacing and unlacing her fingers, suddenly fixed her eyes on Kirsteen. "I don't understand very well, darling, but I am sure that whatever dear John says will be wise and right. You must remember that he is the eldest and has a great deal of experience." Kirsteen bent her head. If there was irony in the gesture, it was not perceived by Frances Freeland. "It can't be right for dear Derek, or any gentleman, to go against the law of the land or be mixed up with wrongdoing in any way. I haven't said anything, but I have felt it very much, because it's all been not quite nice, has it?" Nedda saw her father wince. Then Stanley broke in again. "Now that the whole thing's done with, do for heaven's sake let's have a little peace." At that moment her aunt's face seemed wonderful to Nedda, so quiet yet so burningly alive. "Peace? There is no peace in this world. There is death, but no peace." And moving nearer to Tod, she rested her hand on his shoulder, looking, as it seemed to Nedda, at something far away. Till John said, "That's hardly the point, is it? We should be awfully glad to know that there'll be no more trouble. All this has been very worrying, and now the cause seems to be removed." There was always a touch of finality in John's voice. Nedda saw that all had turned to Kirsteen for her answer. "If those up and down the land who profess belief in liberty will cease to filch from the helpless the very crust of it, the cause will be removed. Which is to say, never." At those words from Felix, Frances Freeland, gazing first at him and then at Kirsteen, said in a pained voice, "I don't think you ought to talk like that, Kirsteen, dear. Nobody who is at all nice means to be unkind. We're all forgetful sometimes. I know I often forget to be sympathetic. Vexes me dreadfully." "Mother, don't defend tyranny." "I'm sure it's often from the best motives, dear." "So is rebellion." "Well, I don't understand about that, darling. But I do think, with dear John, it's a great pity. It would be a dreadful drawback to Derek if he has to look back on something that he regrets when he's older. It's always best to smile and try to look on the bright side of things and not be grumbly. After that little speech of Frances Freeland's, there was a silence that Nedda thought would last forever, till her aunt, pressing close to Tod's shoulder, spoke. "You want me to stop, Derek. I tell you all what I've just told Nedda. I don't attempt to control Derek, I never have. For myself, when I see a thing I hate, I can't help fighting against it. I shall never be able to help that. I understand how you must dislike all this. I know it must be painful to you, Mother. But while there is tyranny in this land, to labourers, women, animals, anything weak and helpless, so long will there be rebellion against it, and things will happen that will disturb you." Again Nedda saw her father wince, but Frances Freeland, bending forward, fixed her eyes piercingly on Kirsteen's neck, as if she were noticing something there more important than that about tyranny. Then John said very gravely, "You seem to think that we approve of such things being done to the helpless. I know that you disapprove." "With the masterly inactivity," Felix said suddenly, in a voice more bitter than Nedda had ever heard from him, "of authority, money, culture, and philosophy, with the disapproval that lifts no finger, winking at tyrannies lest worse befall us. Yes, we, brethren, we, and so we shall go on doing. Quite right, Kirsteen." "No, the world is changing, Felix, changing." But Nedda had started up. There, at the door, was Derek. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Freelands by John Galsworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 38. Derek, who had slept the sleep of the dead, having had none for 2 nights, woke thinking of Nedda hovering above him in the dark, of her face laid down beside him on the pillow. And then, suddenly, up started that thing and stood there, haunting him. Why did it come? What did it want of him? After writing the little note to Nedda, he hurried to the station and found a train about to start. To see and talk with the labourers, to do something, anything to prove that this tragic companion had no real existence. He went first to the Gaunt's cottage. The door there was opened by the rogue girl, comely and robust as ever in a linen frock, with her sleeves rolled up and smiling broadly at his astonishment. "Don't be afraid, Mr. Derek. I'm only here for the weekend, just to tiddy up a bit. 'Tis all right in London. I wouldn't come back here, I wouldn't, not if you was to give me—" And she pouted her red lips. "Where's your father, Wilmot?" "Over in Willie's copse cutting steaks. I hear you've been ill, Mr. Derek. You do look pale. Were you very bad?" And her eyes opened as though the very thought of illness was difficult for her to grasp. "I saw your young lady up in London. She's very pretty. Wish you happiness, Mr. Derek. Grandfather, here's Mr. Derek." The face of old Gaunt, carved, cynical, yellow, appeared above her shoulder. There he stood, silent, giving Derek no greeting. And with a sudden miserable feeling the boy said, "I'll go and find him. Goodbye, Wilmot." "Goodbye, Mr. Derek. 'Tis quiet enough here now. There's changes." Her rogue face twinkled again, and turning her chin she rubbed it on her plump shoulder, as might a heifer, while from behind her Grandfather Gaunt's face looked out with a faint, sardonic grin. Derek, hurrying on to Willie's copse, caught sight along a far hedge of the big dark labourer Tully, who had been his chief lieutenant in the fighting. But whether the man heard his hail or no, he continued along the hedge side without response and vanished over a stile. The field dipped sharply to a stream, and at the crossing Derek came suddenly on the little .Here, .There cowherd, who at Derek's greeting gave him an abrupt "good day," and went on with his occupation of mending a hurdle. Again that miserable feeling beset the boy, and he hastened on. A sound of chopping guided him. Near the edge of the coppice Tom Gaunt was lopping at some bushes. At sight of Derek he stopped and stood waiting, his loquacious face expressionless, his little hard eye cocked. "Good morning, Tom. It's ages since I saw you." "Ah, 'tis a proper long time. You had a knock." Derek winced. It was said as if he had been disabled in an affair in which Gaunt had neither part nor parcel. Then, with a great effort, the boy brought out his question. "You've heard about poor Bob?" "Yes, 'tis the end of him." Some meaning behind those words, the unsmiling twist of that hard-bitten face, the absence of the "sir" that even Tom Gaunt generally gave him, all seemed part of an attack. And feeling as if his heart were being squeezed, Derek looked straight into his face. "What's the matter, Tom?" "Matter? I don't know as there's anything the matter exactly." "What have I done? Tell me." Tom Gaunt smiled. His little grey eyes met Derek's full. "'Tisn't for a gentleman to be held responsible." "Come!" Derek cried passionately. "What is it? Do you think I deserted you, or what? Speak out, man." Abating nothing of his stare and drawl, Gaunt answered, "Deserted? Oh dear, no. I can't afford to do no more dying for you, that's all." For me? Dying? My God, do you think I wouldn't have... Oh, confound you! Aye, confounded us you have. Hope you're satisfied. Pale as death and quivering all over, Derek answered, So you think I've just been frying fish of my own? Tom Gaunt emitted a little laugh. I think you've fried no fish at all. That's what I think. And no one else does neither, if you want to know. Except poor Bob. You've fried his fish, sure enough. Stung to the heart, the boy stood motionless. A pigeon was cooing. The sappy scent from the lopped bushes filled all the sun-warmed air. I see, he said. Thanks, Tom. I'm glad to know. Without moving a muscle, Tom Gaunt answered, Don't mention it, and resumed his lopping. Derek turned and walked out of the little wood. But when he had put a field between him and the sound of Gaunt's billhook, he lay down and buried his face in the grass, chewing at its green blades scarce dry of dew, and with its juicy sweetness tasting the full of bitterness. And the grey shade stalked out again, and stood there in the warmth of the August day, with its scent and murmur of full summer, while the pigeons cooed and dandelion fluff drifted by. When, 2 hours later, he entered the kitchen at home, of the company assembled, Frances Freeland alone retained equanimity enough to put up her face to be kissed. "I'm so thankful you've come back in time to see your uncles, darling. Your Uncle John thinks, and we all agree, that to encourage those poor labourers to do things which are not nice is... you know what I mean, darling." Derek gave a bitter little laugh. "Criminal, Granny. Yes, and puppyish. I've learned all that." The sound of his voice was utterly unlike his own, and Kirsteen, starting forward, put her arm round him. "It's all right, Mother. They've chucked me." At that moment, when all save his mother wanted so to express their satisfaction, Frances Freeland alone succeeded. "I'm so glad, darling." Then John rose, and holding out his hand to his nephew, said, "That's the end of the trouble then, Derek?" "Yes, and I beg your pardon, Uncle John, and all, Uncle Stanley, Uncle Felix, you, Dad, Granny." They had all risen now. The boy's face gave them, even John, even Stanley, a choke in the throat. Frances Freeland suddenly took their arms and went to the door. Her other 2 sons followed. And quietly they all went out. Derek, who had stayed perfectly still, staring past Nedda into a corner of the room, said, "Ask him what he wants, Mother." Nedda smothered down a cry, but Kirsteen, tightening her clasp of him and looking steadily into that corner, answered, "Nothing, my boy. He's quite friendly. He only wants to be with you for a little." "But I can't do anything for him." "He knows that." "I wish he wouldn't, Mother. I can't be more sorry than I have been." Kirsteen's face quivered. "My dear, it will go quite soon. Love, Nedda. See, she wants you." Derek answered in the same quiet voice, "Yes, Nedda is the comfort. Mother, I want to go away out of England, right away." Nedda rushed and flung her arms round him. "I too, Derek, I too." That evening Felix came out to the old fly, waiting to take him from Joyfields to Beckett. What a sky! All over its pale blue a far-up wind had drifted long rosy clouds, and through one of them the half-moon peered, of a cheese-green hue, and, framed and barred by the elm trees like some roseate-stained glass window, the sunset blazed. In a corner of the orchard a little bonfire had been lighted, and round it he could see the 3 small trysts dropping armfuls of leaves and pointing at the flames leaping out of the smoulder. There too was Tod's big figure, motionless, and his dog sitting on its haunches with head poked forward, staring at those red tongues of flame. Kirsteen had come with him to the wicket gate. He held her hand long in his own and pressed it hard. And while that blue figure, turned to the sunset, was still visible, he screwed himself back to look. They had been in painful conclave, as it seemed to Felix, all day, coming to the decision that those 2 young things should have their wish, marry, and go out to New Zealand. The ranch of cousin Alec Morton, son of that brother of Frances Freeland, who, absorbed in horses, had wandered to Australia and died in falling from them, had extended a welcome to Derek. Those 2 would have a voyage of happiness. See together the red sunsets in the Mediterranean, Pompeii, and the dark ants of men swarming in endless band up and down with their coal-sacks at port side. Smell the cinnamon gardens of Colombo. Sit up on deck at night and watch the stars. Who could grudge them? Out there, youth and energy would run unchecked, for here youth had been beaten. On and on the old fly rumbled between the shadowy fields. The world is changing, Felix, changing. Was that defeat of youth, then, nothing? Under the crust of authority and wealth, culture and philosophy, was the world really changing? Was liberty truly astir, under that sky in the west all blood? A man rising at long last from his knees before the god of force? The silent, empty fields darkened. The air gathered dewy thickness, and the old fly rumbled and rolled as slow as fate. Cottage lamps were already lighted for the evening meal. No labourer abroad at this hour. And Felix thought of Trist, the tragic fellow, the moving, lonely figure, emanation of these solitary fields, shade of the departing land. One might well see him as that boy saw him, silent, dogged, in a grey light such as this now clinging above the hedgerows and the grass. The old fly turned into the Beckett's drive. It had grown dark now, save for the half-moon. The last chafer was booming by, and a bat flitting, a little blind, eager bat, through the quiet trees. He got out to walk the last few 100 yards. A lovely night, silent below her stars, cool and dark, spread above field after field, wood on wood, for hundreds of miles on every side. Night, covering his native land. The same silence had reigned out there, the same perfume stolen up, the same starshine fallen for millions of years in the past, and would for millions of years to come. Close to where the half-moon floated, a slow, narrow, white cloud was passing, curiously shaped. At one end of it, Felix could distinctly see the form of a gleaming skull, with dark sky showing through its eye-holes, cheeks, and mouth. A queer phenomenon, fascinating, rather ghastly. It grew sharper in outline, more distinct. One of those sudden shudders that seize men from the crown of the head to the very heels passed down his back. He shut his eyes, and instead there came up before him Kirsteen's blue-clothed figure turned to the sunset glow. Better to see that than this skull above the land. Better to believe her words. The world is changing, Felix. Changing. End of chapter 38. End of The Freelands by John Galsworthy.